Hi everyone, welcome back to Radio Night Crime. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. The tragic tale of the Richardson family murders shattered the peaceful image of Medicine Hat, Alberta. At the center of this shocking crime was a 12-year-old girl, Jasmine Richardson, who became entangled in a forbidden relationship with 23-year-old Jeremy Steinke, a man with a troubled past and dark obsessions. This is the story of how a rebellion can go deadly wrong, of manipulation that can be spun out of control, lives tragically cut short. Most chillingly, it reminds us how easily the darkness in human nature comes to the fore and how superficially ordinary the lives can look while they host turmoil beyond our imagination. Together, they hatched a plan, one that will leave an entire family dead and a community reeling with sadness and horror. What would make a teenage girl and her far older boyfriend commit such a heinous crime? How can love, or what they perceived as love, become so derailed to cause destruction? In this tragic case, we will examine what led up to the murders, what came afterward, and the questions that still linger for those who remember the Richardson family. Medicine Hat, Alberta was a quiet town where neighbors waved to one another. Kids rode bikes, and weekends were marked by block parties and backyard barbecues. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong until 2006, when a crime so horrifying it shook the entire nation and changed everything. The Richardson family looked to be the very portrait of a typical suburban family. In Medicine Hat, Alberta, the Richardson family made it known to their community as a very affectionate and close family. Mark Richardson worked for the oil industry. His occupation was a tough one where he used his due diligence to perform his job and make a comfortable living for his family. He was as dedicated to his job as he was to his family. His wife, Deborah Richardson, was a stay-at-home mom. Her warm and amiable nature made her very popular with the neighbors and friends. She was actively involved in the lives of her two kids, volunteering at their school and making sure all their needs were well taken care of. The couple's two children brought different dynamics into the home. Jacob is the youngest at 8 years old, and what a real bubbly and carefree boy he was. He loves to play with friends, is fond of drawing, and spends hours glued to his favorite cartoons. His innocence combines with such fresh energy that it makes the home of the Richardson family laugh and lighten up with joy. Jacob is the type of little boy who can brighten up any room with smiles. The family had a 12-year-old daughter named Jasmine who was at another stage of life, trying to negotiate the conflicts of adolescence. Like many preteens, she was trying to work out her identity and quest for independence. Jasmine was always bright and inquisitive. However, with her increasing attraction to goth subculture, changes in her were becoming more marked. She was gradually becoming more withdrawn and belligerent, testing boundaries with her parents. Her interest in dark clothing, alternative music, and edgy online communities began to concern Mark and Deborah. At first, they dismissed it as a phase, the normal emanation of some rebellion in a teenager. But Jasmine's increasingly pugnacious personality and mood swings since then had suggested to them that more than mere acting out was going on. Though they were concerned by the changes in Jasmine's behavior, the Richardsons were and would remain a close family. With Mark and Deborah working hard to provide a stable and nurturing environment for their children, they felt that patience and understanding would eventually guide Jasmine back onto a positive path. They set boundaries while trying to encourage open communication to bridge the gap that they, as a family, seemed to be forming from their daughter. To outsiders, the Richardson family looked like a perfect family, a model of suburban harmony. Their house was filled with laughter and warmth, along with the normal ups and downs of family life. But beneath the surface, tensions were quietly building. Jasmine's independence and acts of defiance caused her to clash with her parents and create a fracture that would ultimately have tragic consequences. The cheerful presence of Jacob only compounded the innocence of what was to come next. His playful spirit and close bond with his family made the Richardson tragedy even more devastating. And how this ostensibly ordinary family story would go on to reveal in a fashion nobody could think of, stun a community, and leave the nation in reeling shock at a truth that hardly seemed believable. This is the life of Jasmine Richardson, which took a dark turn when she met Jeremy Steinke, a 23-year-old man who, like her, was into the goth subculture. The two had met through mutual acquaintances and over online forums dedicated to their shared interests. It wasn't long before their connection really heated up, fueled by a common impulse for transgressive thrill-seeking and an attraction to the darker elements of life. What was most alluring to Jasmine was Jeremy's theatrical character. His thick black eyeliner and wardrobe full of black, along with his weird assertion of being a 300-year-old werewolf, made him so mysterious and therefore greatly magnetic for her. Jeremy came from a troubled background marked by abandonment and relentless bullying. These early experiences shaped his rebellious persona, one that glorified darkness and defied societal norms. To Jasmine, he was mysterious and exciting, a stark contrast to her structured suburban life. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Jasmine's relationship with Jeremy became very intense very quickly, in spite of the fact that he was much older than her and also exhibited quite a few red flags. To Jasmine, Jeremy would soon become more than just a love interest. He became a confidant, a partner in rebellion. He listened to her talking about her parents, about being misunderstood, validated her frustration with them, feeding into the growing feeling of estrangement from them. His control over her grew with each passing day. When Mark and Deborah Richardson found out their daughter was involved with Jeremy, they were horrified. The age gap alone was disturbing enough, but more than that, it was Jeremy's creepy persona and the power he had over Jasmine that really worried them. Firm in their resolve to protect their daughter, they put strict rules in place, forbade her from seeing Jeremy and watched everything she did closely. Mark and Deborah hoped these steps would sever the toxic connection and get Jasmine back on a healthier path. But these only made them more alienated from their daughter. Jasmine was going through teenage rebellion, and the image of her parents came out as people who were going to obstruct her path toward happiness. Rather than discouraging her, their restrictions bonded her even more to him, and the couple started to develop a dangerous mentality that defined Mark and Deborah as the people who were out to thwart their love and freedom. Jeremy's influence over Jasmine slowly turned dark. As they fed each other's resentment toward her family, their mutual fixation on Gothic themes and rebellion against society warped into a twisted justification for growing contempt, because they dreamt of a life free from all controls placed upon them by Jasmine's home. They stepped into something a lot darker, a lot more sinister. What started out as a teenage rebellion took a much darker turn. No longer an uneasy alliance between Jasmine and Jeremy, this became the very fuel for the fire that is going to shock the entire community, leaving a scar on those who know and deal with the Richardsons. Forbidden by Jasmine's parents, the young lovers had to resort to secrecy to stay in touch. The connection they shared was torrid, a joint rebellion of sorts which intensified in the shadows. Email, text messaging, and instant online chats kept them alive with each other without her parents finding out. Mark and Deborah Richardson. These clandestine exchanges became a space where their frustrations and dark fantasies took root, eventually spiraling into a chilling plot. Jeremy, with his taste for the dramatic and the sinister in language, coming together with Jasmine's fascination with rebellion, was the kind of catalyst that would further escalate the situation. He validated her anger against her parents, suggesting to her that they were not standing up to him out of an illegitimate concern against their love. The digital trail they left behind is a horrifying descent into shared delusions, where their conversations began to revolve around the idea of eliminating those that were in their way. What began as teenage venting soon turned sinister as their conversations evolved into real plans for murder. One particular email exchange stands out as especially chilling. Jasmine allegedly wrote, "I have this plan. It starts with me killing them and ends with me living with you." The chill in her words, the ice in her tone, left no doubt as to her state of mind. Far from trying to dissuade her, Jeremy threw his arms open wide in embracing the idea of himself as a willing accomplice who would stop at nothing just to be able to stay with her. He boasted about his ability to get ready and commit murder, that his words blended fantasy with intent. This joint delusion had nurtured and grown in every communication while feeding on each other's darker thoughts. Their fantasies developed in their lives over time and gained weight with every passing instance. Soon enough, they became so substantial that their plans seemed very much like something real. Methods were discussed, followed by timing and what actions the girls would take when executing their dreary plans. Jeremy was true to form, using fascination with gothic themes and violence as part of his identity. He armed himself with a knife, a chilling prelude to the horrifying events to come. With this couple, it was no longer the passing thought of murdering Jasmine's family, worked out in every detail, an event the couple convinced themselves would finally free them from authority. The date was set, April 22, 2006. In their twisted minds, that day would mark the beginning of their life together. It was to be that evening when they would massacre the Richardson family, thus freeing Jasmine from what she felt was controlling her, and to live with Jeremy without interference. The finality and resolve in their planning brings into sharp relief the great depths to which they had sunk into their shared fantasy. As the day approached, the horrifying nature of their intentions became clearer and clearer. A relationship that had seemed to be grounded in the typical angst of a teenager wanting independence had transformed into something unimaginably dark. To the Richardson family, April 22nd would bring an end to an ordinary suburban life, but also an end to all that they had built together. Shocking tragedy, born from toxic and delusional love. The Richardson household was unusually quiet on the night of April 22, 2006. Inside, Mark and Deborah Richardson were settling in for a typical evening with no idea of the terror that would soon descend upon them. Their once happy family home, full of laughter and the ordinary sounds of life, would soon become a house of butchery. Outside, Jeremy Steinke approached the house armed and resolute, ready to put into effect a horrific plan hashed in secret. Outside, an all-too-willing 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson waited for him as the nightmare began to unfold. Jeremy entered the house with his intention quite obvious and his weapon at the ready. His first contact was with Deborah, the matriarch of the family. She, realizing the menace that was standing in front of her, fought back with everything she could muster. Her maternal instinct screamed for her to do everything possible to safeguard her family. The struggle was desperate, but Jeremy's attack was savage and relentless. Bravely as she fought, Deborah was no match and fell to his viciousness. The commotion roused Mark, who came rushing to the scene to help his wife. He found her under attack and tried to intervene, but Jeremy's onslaught was just as merciless. Mark, with all his strength and determination, was no match for the ferocity of the attack, and he too fell at the hands of Jeremy's relentless violence. The loss of both parents in such a horrific manner sent the Richardson home into chaos and despair. Amid the chaos, 8-year-old Jacob hid in his bed, clutching whatever he could find to comfort him, frightened and disoriented. The sounds of violence must have been unimaginable to the young boy, who probably hoped that, by remaining silent, he would be spared. But Jeremy showed no mercy at all. He hunted down Jacob and killed the young boy in an act so pointless and brutal, it highlighted the depravity of the night. Witnesses and later investigators reported that Jasmine either actively assisted or, at the very least, helped to enable Jeremy in the murder of Jacob. The extent of her involvement added another layer of horror to an already unimaginable crime. By the time the bloodshed had stopped, the Richardson home was one of unimaginable carnage. The walls and floors were soaked in blood and unnatural stillness. Silence settled over the house. The warmth and love that had once filled this family environment were transformed into a house of horror in a matter of hours. The sheer violence of the crime left even experienced investigators shaken. And with the murders, Jasmine and Jeremy fled, and in that flight, left the shattered remains of a family. In their actions, 3 lives were taken from those who had every right to live them, along with any semblance of a sense of community safety and normalcy. From a symbol of suburban stability, the Richardson family became a cautionary tale for all that knew them, the epicenter of tragedy. It was to be a threshold night of darkness, marking no turning back, with so many questions still unasked and an overall feeling of loss seeping in. It was the next morning when peace in this quiet suburban neighborhood was shattered, as a boy came to the Richardson home to play with his best friend, Jacob. No one answered when he rang the front doorbell. Curiosity got the better of him, and he peered through a window, and what he saw would forever haunt him. Inside, the bloodied bodies of Mark and Deborah Richardson lay motionless. The scene was ghastly, an unbelievable sight for anyone, let alone a child. Terrified, he fled to wake his parents up. They immediately dialed the police. What police found when they arrived at the Richardson home was a scene of unthinkable carnage. Blood covered the walls and the floor. The gruesome pictures told of the terrible violence that had taken place that night. As the officers further entered the house, they found Mark and Deborah's dead bodies in the living room, and an 8-year-old boy, Jacob, was found dead on the floor in his bedroom. The brutality of the crime left even veteran officers shaken. Initially, the fact that 12-year-old Jasmine was missing led to fears of abduction. Police believed she might have been kidnapped by the killer, possibly another victim of that heinous crime. An Amber Alert was considered as investigators scrambled to piece together what had happened. But as they scoured the scene for evidence, their suspicions began to shift. But the discovery of Jasmine's belongings, complete with disturbing messages exchanged with an older man, Jeremy Steinke, painted a far more sinister and disturbing picture. And the more the investigators dug, the more they found. Emails, social media messages, and exchanges of text between Jasmine and Jeremy that alluded to their sinister plan. They had discussed their mutual fantasies of murder, and a plan to kill anyone who would come between them. It became all the more obvious that Jasmine was no victim, but an active accomplice in the crime. Meanwhile, Jasmine and Jeremy had left the crime scene and driven a few miles to a town where they were to hide from police. They went into hiding at some friend's place, who did not have any idea about the killings. People in that place stated later that the couple were carrying on as if nothing had happened. They were photographed laughing, holding hands and kissing, their carefree demeanor a chilling testimony to their detachment from the atrocities they had committed. Most unnerving was their lack of remorse. This fact underlined even more the warped dynamic between these two. Their attempts at hiding did not last long. Within 24 hours, police, using witness reports and evidence from the crime scene, tracked them down. The couple was arrested, and their cold-blooded plot came to a stop. That Jasmine was involved added another layer to an already inexplicable and shocking tragedy in the eyes of the community. The Richardson murders was a story that continued to enthrall and horrify, an incident whose chilling evidence told of how innocence could swiftly slip into darkness. The trial following the gruesome murders of Jasmine's family members made national headlines. Being one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent decades, it touched off debate after debate over the nature of youth involvement in violent crimes and the responsibilities of adults in influencing minors. Jasmine, only 12 years of age at the time of the murders, was tried under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. This law entitles her, because of age, to particular protections. Nonetheless, she was put on trial just like any adult for her actions in a court of law. Because Jeremy was aged 23 years, he too was tried as an adult. The full weight of the law bore down upon him. Prosecutors at trial painted a chilling narrative of the perverse relationship that Jasmine and Jeremy shared, portraying a picture of a young girl who was more than just an active participant in the ruthless scheme and planning that went into the cruel murder. The prosecution described how Jeremy had coldly manipulated Jasmine, using his control over her, to get her to go along with the murders of her own family members. They said that though young, Jasmine was well aware of the seriousness of her acts and bore equal responsibility for the murders. The killings had been harrowing in their details, and prosecutors insisted that this was a case of premeditated murder, not some spontaneous act of violence. In contrast, the defense team endeavored to emphasize the vulnerability of Jasmine at 12 years of age and argued that she was easily influenceable by an older, more experienced individual like Jeremy. They claimed that Jasmine had been brainwashed and forced to commit the murders. Therefore, she was not actually aware of what she was doing or fully realizing the gravity of the actions she had committed. The defense depicted Jeremy as a manipulative individual who had exploited the naivety and emotional immaturity of Jasmine to use her trust for his own evil deeds. They urged the court to take her age and the very real likelihood that she had been led astray into account, being incapable of making decisions for herself. As the trial developed, so did the evidence against both defendants. testimony from witnesses, forensic evidence, and a deep look into the relationship between the couple painted a picture of a pattern of manipulation and control by Jeremy. The defense of brainwashing wasn't enough to convince the jury that Jasmine's participation in the murders was more than just being under the influence of another. She had been an active participant in the planning, execution, and aftermath of the killings, leaving no doubt that she was criminally responsible. Finally, the court gave its verdict. Jasmine was pronounced guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. While her youthfulness had to be taken into consideration during the sentencing, her actions were, by far, too severe in nature for her to be let off with an easy sentence. So she was sentenced to the maximum penalty possible for a juvenile, 10 years in a youth detention facility, including 4 years spent in a psychiatric facility and 4 years under conditional supervision. Meanwhile, Jeremy got the toughest possible sentence, 3 consecutive life sentences without chance of parole for 25 years. The sentence was reflective of the heinous nature of the crimes, but, in many ways, the fact that was central to all of this, bringing the other 2 into it through his manipulative ways. When she was released in 2016, Jasmine was given complete anonymity to protect her privacy and to help her adjust to life outside the institution. She has, under a new identity, reportedly started afresh, away from the glare of the public eye that had followed her case for years. Her release marked the end of a legal odyssey that had drawn widespread national attention and stirred a wide debate. To many, her case is one of rehabilitation and redemption, a paean to the possibility of reform by young offenders in appropriate circumstances. Her supporters point out that she did serve her full sentence, time in a psychiatric facility, plus completing all requirements for conditional supervision without incident. To them, she is a case study in how the justice system can give second chances, more so for the young who might have been coaxed or otherwise induced into committing acts that are heinous. Others will, however, not agree with this. To the critics, giving Jasmine a new identity and a second chance at leading a normal life does not quite balance the enormity of her crimes. They wonder whether justice was ever really served for the family whose members' lives she violently snuffed out. Her anonymity felt like insulation from accountability, and critics thought it set bad precedents, undermining the seriousness of what she had done. It gives evidence to a deeper debate over the young and justice, that is, chances for rehabilitation, how to strike a balance in considering, on one end, the shielding of offenders and, on the other end, justice for the victims. Often cited as an example, her case is almost always hotly debated in the debate over the morality and utility of sentencing minors for violent crimes. While this may be Jeremy's story, he himself remains in prison, serving the brunt of his sentence, 3 life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. Jeremy's case differs from Jasmine's in one major respect. His identity has never been concealed, and so he often figures as the aggressor in these tragic events. His part in the crime has often been examined to explain a kind of relationship that seems to deteriorate into an inexplicable downward spiral. The influences of Jeremy upon Jasmine, his background, his motives, had been a subject of psychological studies and media analysis. His story will always serve to remind one, to give an example of the worst that unbridled manipulation and dysfunctional dynamics can unleash when allowed to culminate in unbelievable acts of violence. To many, Jeremy epitomizes the dark side of relationships, in which control and manipulation supplant trust and respect. His ongoing incarceration, to some, serves as a form of protection from doing harm to others. But his case does bring up questions as to how much more could have been helped by mental health intervention, and what the responsibilities of society are in trying to halt these kinds of behaviors before they grow into tragedy. In a nutshell, the case of Jasmine and Jerry continued to echo and served as a social research into the crime, justice, and problem of human behavior. Their case went on to show the complexity in criminal justice, especially for minors, how shocking it was to remind them of the far-reaching consequences of violence and toxic relationships. The Richardson family murders are the icy reminder of how a life that appears quite normal can plunge so quickly and unexpectedly into tragedy. Too terrible to be imagined. This case, extremely disturbing, places us face to face with questions that are not easy to deal with, pointing to the dark side of love, manipulation, and human relationships' thin veneer. It flags how dangerous toxic dynamics can spiral into catastrophic consequences, even within a family that appeared on the surface to be loving and stable. The case of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke shook the very foundation of the small community of Medicine Hat, Alberta, and was felt far and wide even today. What really set this case apart, however, was the especially heinous nature of the murders and the extreme youth of those involved. Jasmine was but a 12-year-old girl at the time. Few cases in the history of Canadian true crime have had such a significant impact. It exposed vulnerabilities of youth to manipulation while also touching on very difficult questions of culpability, rehabilitation, and justice. To the people of Medicine Hat, the murders are more than a sad chapter in their history. They're a ghostly reminder of how fragile trust can be and how devastating the consequences can be once that trust is broken. The case, even years later, still sparks an outrage reaching far beyond the town's borders, drawing in and unsettling all who hear about it. The Richardson family murders highlight the complexities of human behavior and the far-reaching impact of violence on individuals, families, and communities. The Richardson family murders are a case in point as to the very many intricacies of human behaviors and just how far, in what measure, violence may ripple through individual persons, families, and communities. Story 2. Directly to the killer who may be in this room, we believe you are hiding in plain sight. For more than 2 years, you never thought we would shift gears to a different investigative strategy, but we have. They say having a best friend means having someone to lean on, and for Libby and Abigail that was true right up until their tragic end. Just hours after Libby posted this photo online, she and Abigail vanished without a trace, sparking one of Delphi's most chilling mysteries. Over the years, eerie theories have circulated, with some suggesting the girls were sacrifices in a dark cult, a theory that, shockingly, investigators haven't entirely dismissed. But is that what really happened, or was the killer just clever enough to stay hidden? Trust me, this case will leave you questioning everything as we uncover every haunting detail of what happened to these two best friends. The result of the new information and intelligence over time leads us to believe the sketch, which you will see shortly, is the person responsible for the murders of these two little girls. This press conference held in 2019 had everyone on edge. Doug Carter from the Indiana State Police delivered a chilling message to the unknown killer, saying they were likely hiding in plain sight, blending into the very community shaken by one of its most brutal cases. Now, to understand the gravity of his warning, we need to go back 2 years earlier to Monday, February 13, 2017. Abigail Williams, 13, and Liberty German, 14, known as Libby, were the type of best friends who did everything together. That Sunday night, they were at Libby's house, excited about a rare Monday off from school. Abby had brought along a box of arts and crafts supplies, and the two spent the evening working on projects in Libby's room and tossing a softball around in the backyard. By Monday afternoon, their creative energy turned into a craving for adventure. The girls came up with a plan to visit a local nature reserve near the Monon High Bridge, a well-known hangout spot in Delphi. They convinced Libby's older sister Kelsey to drive them there, and by 1:30 in the afternoon they were dropped off near the bridge. Now the area was a rugged beauty and quiet charm, with wooded trails that led to the towering Monon High Bridge. This old railway bridge, built in 1891, had long been abandoned but still attracted locals who came to enjoy the view, snap photos, and soak in the peaceful atmosphere. It was the perfect spot for two best friends to explore, laugh, and make memories. But what started as a fun adventure that day would soon turn into a nightmare, a tragedy that shook Delphi to its core. At around 2:07 in the afternoon, Libby shared a photo on Snapchat of Abby carefully walking across the old weathered wooden planks of the Monon High Bridge. Now that photo would turn out to be the last known sign of the two best friends. Later that day, when Libby's dad arrived to pick them up, the girls were nowhere in sight. At first, there was confusion, then growing panic as calls to their phones went unanswered. Libby's dad searched the area calling their names, but the only response was the quiet of the woods. He reached out to Kelsey asking if she'd heard from the girls, or if he was in the wrong spot. She hadn't, and he wasn't. By evening, the fear set in. The police were called, and what started as a search by family quickly grew into a massive community effort. Search crews combed the trails and woods surrounding the bridge, while locals joined in shouting for Abby and Libby. Attempts to trace the girls' cell phones led nowhere. According to the locals, that night was filled with flashlights flickering in the woods looking like stars, as everyone in the community came together to search for Abby and Libby. Some people thought maybe the girls just went off somewhere or were partying, but their families weren't buying it. As the hours passed, the search was called off just before midnight, with law enforcement reassuring everyone that there was no evidence the girls were in immediate danger and that the search would pick back up in the morning. The next day, February 14th, everyone was still holding on to hope, praying for a miracle, but then a shocking discovery was made. One of the search team members found Abby and Libby, but it wasn't good. The girls had been murdered and their bodies were discovered less than a mile from where they'd been dropped off the day before. The authorities were now focused on finding who was responsible, but despite the many tips that flooded in, the killer's identity stayed hidden for months. This small town of just about 3,000 people was rocked to its core. The idea that two young girls were murdered in broad daylight seemed unfathomable, and the shock was felt throughout the entire community. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from Libby's own phone. Police discovered that Libby had been filming Abby as she walked across the bridge. In that video, she also captured the voice and image of a man walking alongside them. The man in the footage became known as Bridge Guy. Authorities believe this man is their killer. In hopes of getting public help, the authorities released still photos from the video. Not the full footage, but enough to hopefully spark someone's memory. They also created a sketch based on witness descriptions of a man seen on the trail that day. Bridge Guy was described as a white man around 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 10 inches, weighing between 180 and 220 pounds, with reddish-brown hair. The grainy photos showed a man in blue jeans, a blue jacket, and a hoodie. Police had also released 2 sketches based on descriptions from eyewitnesses. One sketch looked like an older man while the other resembled a younger man. Despite all of this, no arrests were made. So in an effort to push the investigation forward, the authorities released a clip of the man's voice heard saying, "Down the hill," in the footage that Libby had captured. This new piece of evidence was meant to stir up public interest and hopefully spark a lead. At the time, the police referred to the video as coming from possible criminal activity, trying to keep the focus on finding the person responsible. Another key detail that investigators shared was that they believed the murderer either lived in Delphi or was familiar with the town. Whether they worked there or had some other connection, the killer had knowledge of the area, and that detail kept everyone on edge, hoping someone would recognize the voice, the face, or the details and help crack the case wide open. In April of 2019, more than 2 years after Libby and Abby were found murdered, law enforcement held another press conference that grabbed everyone's attention. It was during this conference that ISP Superintendent Doug Carter made a direct appeal to the killer, telling him, "I know you're hiding in plain sight." He went on to say, "I believe you have just a little bit of a conscience left, and I can assure you that how you left them in that woods is not what they're experiencing today." By this point, the police had received a lot of tips, and there were quite a few people linked to the case as potential suspects. Some of them matched the 2 sketches police had released, but one name that came up early was Ron Logan. He was an older guy who lived in Delphi, Indiana, and his connection to the case wasn't just because of his age, it was because of where he lived. The bodies of Libby and Abby were found less than a mile from Logan's property, just a short walk from the Monon High Bridge, the spot where the girls were last seen. In a small town like Delphi, that kind of proximity made Logan a prime person of interest right off the bat. Logan had lived on a quiet country road near the trail that led to the Monon High Bridge for over 50 years. It was a peaceful area where families often walked, so it seemed like the last place something horrible like this could happen. But once the girls' bodies were discovered, that peaceful spot felt much darker and more sinister. Now, Logan didn't exactly help himself. When the girls went missing, he told the police he had been out of town at an aquarium, which seemed like a pretty solid alibi. But then things started to take a strange turn. It came out that Logan had asked a relative to lie for him about his whereabouts that day. That raised a huge red flag. If he had nothing to hide, why would he try to cover up where he was? Things got even more complicated a month after the murders, when the FBI stepped in. In March 2017, the FBI got the green light to search Ronald Logan's property, including his house, garage, pickup truck, computers, and cell phones. In the warrant request, the FBI agent made it clear that there was probable cause to believe Logan had committed the murders and that evidence could be found on his land. The agent even went into detail about why they thought Logan was involved. But before we dive into that, the request revealed some new details about the crime scene that had never been shared before. First, the FBI confirmed that one of the victims was missing a piece of clothing. There were no signs of a struggle or fight at the crime scene, and investigators found fibers and unidentified hairs. It also appeared that the bodies had been moved and staged. The agent even referenced the infamous video on Libby's phone, confirming that it was 43 seconds long, though up until then, only a few seconds had been released to the public. The footage showed the suspect following the girls on the Monon High Bridge Trail, and there were no visible signs of a fight. The search warrant for Logan's property, which was located right next to where the girls' bodies were found, revealed more suspicious details. The FBI agent said Logan had asked a relative to create a fake alibi for the afternoon the girls went missing. On top of that, cell tower data showed Logan's phone was in the area where the girls disappeared, and later that night, it was near where the bodies were eventually discovered. Logan's ex-girlfriends also spoke out, revealing disturbing details about his behavior. Both reported that he had been physically abusive, with one woman stating that Logan had threatened her, saying he could kill her and no one would ever find her body. The agent also mentioned that the victims lost a lot of blood, and it was almost certain that they would have gotten blood on their person or clothing. Additionally, 2 pieces of clothing from one of the girls were missing, and it seemed like the bodies had been intentionally moved and staged. The agent speculated that the killer might have taken a souvenir or done something to memorialize the crime scene. As investigators scoured Logan's property, they were hoping to find something that could link him to the murders. Logan, however, continued to insist that he had been in Lafayette, 20 miles away, buying tropical fish, and he didn't return home until 6:30 in the evening. But when police looked into his alibi, they found that his cousin, who was supposedly with him, didn't back up his story. In fact, they couldn't confirm any of Logan's alibi details. Despite the investigation, including extensive searches of his property, nothing concrete was found to directly tie Logan to the murders. He did have a history of legal troubles, including a previous DUI conviction, and as part of his probation, he wasn't allowed to drive. Investigators believed that was why he had asked his relative to lie for him. In a twist, Logan was later arrested for violating his probation, though it was unrelated to the Delphi murders. This gave investigators the chance to search his property again while he was in custody. But once again, no direct evidence was found that linked him to the crime. Suspicions surrounding Logan officially died down when he passed away in 2020 due to COVID-19. But just when it seemed like things had gone cold, another person of interest came to light. This time, it's a man named Keegan Anthony Klein. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. At the time, Klein was 30 years old and had a disturbing history of internet catfishing. One of the accounts he used was under the username Anthony Shots. Police believe that the Anthony Shots Instagram profile was used to solicit explicit pictures from young girls. But the story gets darker. Klein was actually chatting with Libby German on the day of the murders. Not only that, but he allegedly told another girl that he was supposed to meet Libby that day. It was hard to ignore the eerie coincidence. The last person to speak to Libby was an online predator. Was it just a twist of fate? Or did Klein somehow know the killer? Could he have been involved in the crime in some way? Police didn't waste time and searched his home in Peru, Indiana. Now Klein was never formally charged with the murders, but what they found in his home was enough to lead to serious charges. During the search, investigators uncovered explicit images of children, which led to his arrest on charges of child exploitation and possession of child pornography. Indiana State Police Officer Christopher Cecil testified that Klein used fake personas to convince girls, ranging from 12 to 18 years old, to send him explicit photos or videos. Investigators identified 11 victims, but they suspected there were even more who had not yet come forward. In a 2022 jailhouse interview, Klein admitted to trying to solicit explicit images from underage girls. However, he claimed that he never intended to meet any of them in real life, saying he was simply lonely and didn't really know why he did it. Consider yourself like a pedophile? No, I would not. That's even what I put in the PSI now. Like I told in the PSI, when I'm out in public, I don't look at teenage girls or kids. I don't think sexually about them at all. What do you think happened in terms of then, some of the things you're accused of doing? Like I told in the PSI, it just kind of spiraled out. I mean, I didn't have a girlfriend. I was a lonely guy and I started talking to girls online and it just kind of spiraled into something. And I don't know. It's crazy. Klein pled guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 40 years in prison with an additional 3 years suspended. His sentence was a reminder of the severity of his crimes, but it still didn't bring closure to the case of Abby and Libby. This was in 2022, 5 years after the horrific murders, and many feared that justice might never come. For years, it seemed like the case had gone cold. Investigators had little progress and the community was growing increasingly frustrated. Then, on October 26th, that same year, everything changed when 50-year-old Richard Allen was arrested and charged with the murders of Abby and Libby. The news hit like a bombshell. Richard Allen wasn't some stranger or distant figure. He was a familiar face in the small town of Delphi, a family man married with a daughter and working at the local CVS pharmacy. Shockingly, he had even printed memorial photos for the victims' families. How could someone so deeply embedded in the community be capable of such an awful crime? It seemed unimaginable, but perhaps just maybe, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter's words from 3 years earlier had been eerily accurate. The killer is hiding in plain sight. The case, which had seemed nearly impossible to solve, was now taking a startling turn. No one had anticipated how challenging this case would be to crack. Nearly 6 years of relentless searching, over 70,000 tips, countless sketches of potential suspects, and even the famous grainy video from Libby's phone all failed to lead them to the killer. As investigators finally closed in on Allen, it raised the question, how had they missed him for so long? Why did it take so long for this piece of the puzzle to fall into place? As it turns out, Richard Allen, who had been a local man in Delphi for years, had put himself on the trail the day of the murders, wearing the exact same clothing as the bridge guy described by witnesses. Even more chilling were the accounts from several witnesses who claimed to have seen someone resembling Richard on the trail that day. One witness even reported seeing a man walking down the road covered in muddy and bloody clothes. Then investigators discovered an unused bullet at the crime scene that matched a gun owned by Richard Allen. This was a major piece of evidence that tied him directly to the crime. The arrest was swift, but Richard's defense team immediately released a statement trying to set the record straight about their client and the ongoing investigation. The defense made several key points in their statement, and I'll quote them directly here. Richard is a 50-year-old man who has never been arrested nor accused of any crime in his entire life. He is innocent and completely confused as to why he has been charged with these crimes. The police did not contact Rick after Libby German and Abby Williams went missing. Rather, Rick contacted the police and voluntarily discussed being on the trail that day. Like many people in Delphi, Rick wanted to help in any way he could. He contacted the police to let them know that he had walked on the trail that day, as he often did. Without Rick coming forward, the police probably would not have even had any way of knowing that he was on the trail that day. Rick volunteered to meet with a conservation officer outside of the local grocery store to offer details of his trip to the trail. Rick tried to assist with the investigation and told the police that he did recall seeing 3 younger girls on the trail that day. His contact with the girls was brief and of little significance. Rick does not recall if his interaction with the conservation officer was tape-recorded, but he believes the officer scribbled notes on a notepad as Rick spoke to him. The statement continued, stating that after Rick provided this information, he went back to his job at the local CVS and didn't hear from the police for more than 5 years. The next time he heard from law enforcement was in October 2022, right around the time of a contested sheriff's election. The timing seemed a bit suspicious to some. The defense team also pointed to the fact that Richard had not disposed of his vehicle, guns, or clothing in the 5 years since he voluntarily spoke to the police. He hadn't changed his appearance or relocated. Instead, he continued with his normal routine, which the defense argued was the behavior of an innocent man. However, things took another unexpected turn when months later, new documents revealed shocking details. The records indicated that Richard had allegedly confessed to the murders, not just once, but multiple times. These confessions were reportedly made during phone calls with his wife, Kathy, and even with his own mother. In each of these instances, Kathy would allegedly end the call abruptly. After these confessions, Richard's mental health rapidly deteriorated. He lost weight, stopped eating and sleeping, and even broke his tablet, his only connection to the outside world. He began acting out, engaging in bizarre behaviors such as eating legal documents from his attorneys. This revelation took the case to an even darker place. The defense argued that these confessions were made under extreme mental distress due to Richard's protective confinement and that they were not reliable. Despite the defense's concerns, the judge refused to move Richard to another facility, stating that he was actually receiving better treatment than other inmates in the same prison. But the plot thickened once again. The defense filed a bizarre 136-page memorandum, which shifted the focus away from Richard Allen and pointed the finger at a group of individuals following a pagan Norse religion known as Odinism. These individuals, the defense claimed, were responsible for the murders. In the memorandum, the defense referenced an FBI agent's disclosure in 2017, which revealed that the bodies of Abby and Libby appeared to have been manipulated and deliberately staged. Prior to this, very little was known about the crime scene. No autopsy results had been shared, and only text messages, allegedly written by Abby's Uncle David, had circulated online. These texts revealed details about the girls' bodies. They were found near each other, touching but not bound. Abby was clothed, but Libby was naked, with leaves and sticks covering the top half of her body. Their throats had allegedly been cut. The most shocking part of this new development was the defense's claim that symbols resembling runes, associated with Odinism, had been found at the crime scene. They argued that these symbols were left behind by individuals connected to this Odinist cult, shifting the focus away from Richard and suggesting a far darker and more complex narrative. One of the more striking elements was the discovery of Libby's body, found positioned at the base of a tree. Her left arm was extended above her head, touching the tree, while her right arm lay by her side. Numerous branches were placed over her in a deliberate pattern, including one large branch running from her head to her legs. The defense suggested that the lack of blood near Libby's neck and tree indicated she may have been killed elsewhere before being moved. Abby's body, found just a few feet away, was fully clothed, but dressed in Libby's jeans and sweatshirt. The defense proposed that Abby had been killed earlier and then redressed by the alleged perpetrators. Despite fatal neck wounds, little blood was found on her clothing, except around her neck, implying efforts to keep her body clean. Abby's body was positioned with her right leg bent beneath her left leg, and branches were arranged in a pattern on top of her, resembling an asterisk. The defense also noted that one of the branches appeared to be cleanly cut, suggesting premeditation. Above Abby's head, smaller sticks were placed over her hair, mimicking horns or antlers. Further unsettling details included a red F-shaped stain on a nearby tree, confirmed to be Libby's blood. The defense argued that this symbol resembled the Norse rune Ensuz, which stands for Odin. They also pointed to the symbol Hagalaz found on Abby's body, linking it to the Norse god of hail. The defense theorized that these runes suggested a ritualistic motive behind the killings. The defense challenged the prosecution's timeline, which suggested the murders occurred within a short window, claiming it was implausible for one person, especially someone of Richard Allen's small stature, to have committed the murders alone. They raised questions about the discovery of a bullet buried between the girls and its connection to a gun owned by Allen, asking when it was found, immediately after the bodies were discovered or days later. The defense argued that the murders required more time than one person could manage in such a short window. The defense also pointed to the connection between Abby and Odinism. Abby's alleged boyfriend's father, known as BH, had ties to Odinism and social media posts resembling the symbols found at the crime scene. The defense claimed that BH had made references to the crime scene before details were publicly released. The theory also included the disturbing meme posted by BH days after the murders, joking about helping dispose of bodies and remaining silent. Another potential suspect was mentioned by the defense, who claimed he admitted to being involved in the murders. The defense also alleged that several law enforcement officers involved in the investigation privately believed in the Odinism theory, but were suppressed to focus on Alan. In terms of Alan's mental health, the defense argued that his deteriorating condition in prison may have led to coerced confessions. They claimed that threats from Odinist members working as guards had pressured him into confessing. Additionally, they accused the lead investigator of withholding crucial evidence to gain a search warrant for Alan's home. Another significant issue raised was the destruction of evidence. The defense claimed that 70 days' worth of interviews with witnesses had been destroyed, which could have been crucial in the early stages of the investigation. This led to further frustrations from the defense as they sought to challenge the prosecution's case. During a 3-day hearing in 2024, the defense's Odinism theory was debated, with the prosecution presenting evidence to refute it. The prosecution called in a blood spatter expert who testified that the blood on the tree was a transfer stain, not painted, though the expert couldn't determine who transferred the blood. The defense also argued that Alan's confessions, over 60 in total, were coerced and should not be admissible in court. They argued that Alan's mental health had worsened due to his severe treatment in a maximum security facility, leading to stress-induced psychosis. Several witnesses testified to Alan's deteriorating condition, including his bizarre behavior and his eventual confession to the murders. A DNA expert also testified that there was no trace of Alan's DNA at the crime scene, and there was also no sign of Libby or Abby's DNA on any of the items found at his home. So, while his confession seemed to be a big step toward closing the case, physical evidence wasn't quite backing up his involvement. But today we heard there's no DNA evidence connecting Alan to this crime, right? Yeah, Scott, we got some very technical and very scientific testimony today. One talking about DNA evidence, another talking about blood patterns. It made for a really hard day for both the families and for the jurors in court. The only key piece of evidence prosecutors focused on was the .40 caliber bullet found near the girls' bodies. An expert for the prosecution claimed it matched Alan's gun, but the defense wasn't buying it, pointing out that there weren't enough images taken of the cartridge and even suggested that the bullet could have come from a law enforcement officer's weapon. That raised a lot of eyebrows about the reliability of this piece of evidence. The prosecution also worked hard to link Alan to the chilling bridge guy video and audio recording taken by Libby on her phone just before the girls were murdered. State Police Master Trooper Brian Harshman, who reviewed over 700 of Alan's prison calls, testified that in his opinion the voice on that recording matched Alan's voice. It was a bold statement, but some still had their doubts. Then the moment arrived. On November 11, 2024, Alan was convicted on all counts. Just a month later, on December 20, 2024, Judge Gull sentenced him to 130 years in prison, 65 years for each of the girls' murders to be served consecutively. He was immediately transported to the Westville Correctional Facility to start serving his time. But here's the thing. While some people were relieved to see justice served, there's still a big divide. A lot of people are questioning how it took 5 years for anyone to connect Alan to the case. There were those sketches, the videos, the voices. So why didn't anyone think to investigate Alan sooner? And let's not forget that his arrest happened just in time for a sheriff election, which raised even more suspicions. Story 3. They say the devil doesn't make you do it. He just points out how easy it is to step over the edge. And that's exactly what happened in the early hours of August 15, 1967. It was the day Canada witnessed one of its most chilling, most tragic, random mass murders, leaving 9 innocent souls lost forever. Victor Hoffman, a troubled young man fresh out of a mental hospital, was desperate to avoid going back. Back in the 1960s, mental health care was far from what it is today. It was underfunded, misunderstood, and often stigmatized. So Victor made himself a promise. He wouldn't return to that place. And oh boy, he kept that promise. But in a way so chilling it lingers in your mind long after you hear the story. But before we dive into the dark heart of it all, let's take a step back and understand Victor's childhood and what led him to that mental facility in the first place. Born in 1946, Victor grew up in what seemed like a typical hardworking family. His parents, Robert and Stella Hoffman, were devout Lutherans living in the small village of Liask, Canada. The Hoffmans were known for their dedication to farming, their faith, and keeping Sundays sacred. They were the kind of family people would describe as ordinary and God-fearing. Victor was the fifth of 7 children in the Hoffman household. As a boy, he didn't stand out much from his siblings. His parents described him as a diligent, responsible child who hit all the usual milestones. By all accounts, he was a solid worker on the family farm and had a natural knack for hunting. He loved guns and spent a lot of time honing his skills as a hunter. However, there was one thing about Victor that set him apart. He was a loner. He didn't have friends and struggled in school, largely because he couldn't concentrate. Still, his parents didn't think much of it at the time. To them, Victor was just a quiet, independent kid. However, Victor later told psychiatrists that his struggles began when he was just 6 years old. That was the first time he saw the devil. He described the figure vividly, a towering black creature, 6 feet tall with a long tail. From that moment, he felt torn between 2 forces, God and Satan, each trying to claim him. The battle within Victor's mind was relentless. He often woke up in the middle of the night to strange, tapping sounds that would grow louder and faster. By the time he turned 10, these experiences had grown darker. Victor began having violent impulses, urges to kill that consumed his thoughts daily. He fantasized about harming his family and even strangers he had just met. But Victor kept his disturbing thoughts to himself, hiding them from his parents and siblings. To cope, he directed his violent tendencies toward animals. Killing animals gave him a sense of relief, even happiness, which he likened to the satisfaction a hunter feels after a successful kill. The devil, however, never left Victor alone. One morning while eating breakfast, he heard a voice calling out to him. Following the voice outside, he claimed to have encountered Satan again, this time in an even more grotesque form. A 6'6" man, weighing over 300 pounds, with the face of a pig. The devil promised Victor wealth and power in exchange for his soul. Though Victor claimed he didn't want to make a deal, he admitted to kneeling on one knee, hoping to at least become half as rich. But nothing came of it. Now, these encounters with the devil only deepened his already fragile mental state. He also claimed to see cold, dismembered hands floating in his room, and worse, he could feel them touch him. The devil's visits became a regular occurrence, with the dark figure relentlessly approaching Victor, asking for his soul. But no matter how many times the devil came, Victor refused to give in. Not long after these visits started, Victor allegedly began seeing angels. Unlike the devil, these angels appeared less frequently. According to Victor, they looked like human women, dressed elegantly, and their main goal was to guide him away from the devil's grasp. Victor believed they were messengers of God, sent to protect him and keep him on the right path. One day, Victor claimed he received a divine message. The angels and God themselves had tasked him with an extraordinary mission. If he could capture and destroy the devil, they promised to take him to heaven. This message consumed Victor. It gave him a sense of purpose, though it only made his behavior more erratic. Determined to fulfill this divine task, Victor tried everything he could think of to trap the devil. He started with nets, but those plans didn't work. Frustrated, he came up with a new plan. He'd shoot the devil down. On May 27, 1966, Victor's mother Stella found him outside in their backyard, firing his rifle into the sky. By the time she got there, he had already fired 3 rounds. Confused and understandably scared, Stella demanded to know what he was doing. His answer was chilling yet simple. "I shot the devil." Stella begged him to stop and managed to coax him back inside the house. Victor reluctantly put the rifle down, but then grabbed the family car and drove off. While he was gone, Stella and the rest of the family scrambled to hide every gun in the house. When Victor returned, he asked for the guns back, promising no harm would come to anyone. But his family refused. Agitated, he left again, only to come back shortly after, this time asking to speak with their pastor. The pastor arrived, and the two had a private conversation. Stella couldn't hear much of what was said, but when they stepped outside to finish their talk, she heard Victor say something that shook her to her core. I'd like to kill my mom. That was it. Stella and her husband, Robert, knew they couldn't wait any longer. The next day, they made arrangements to have Victor admitted to Saskatchewan Hospital. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Back in 1967, Saskatchewan Hospital was a big mental health facility located in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, Canada. At that time, mental health care wasn't as advanced as it is now. Hospitals like Saskatchewan were more like institutions, where patients were often locked away and given basic care. The focus wasn't really on helping people get better or recover. Patients were more or less kept in check. Treatments were mainly about managing symptoms with medication, and there wasn't much emphasis on understanding or treating the root causes of their conditions. Now, when Victor underwent his initial psychiatric evaluation, the attending doctor officially diagnosed him with schizophrenia. The severity of his condition left no room for debate. Victor needed to be hospitalized. Surprisingly, he didn't resist. He voluntarily agreed to commit himself, perhaps believing it was the best option for everyone, including himself. According to the records, he wasn't just battling a serious mental illness. His body was also showing signs of stress. He'd often be found talking to himself, laughing at nothing, and deep in confusion about his own identity. At one point, he even questioned whether he was a boy or a girl, adding to the chaos in his mind. He was cooperative with the doctors during his exams, but came across as withdrawn, vague, and indifferent. It seemed like Victor felt like an outsider in his own family, as they just couldn't understand what he was going through. He mentioned to his siblings that he saw the devil, but they just mocked him, laughing off his concerns. Victor wasn't just imagining things, though. He believed the devil was punishing him because he refused to sell his soul. At one point, he even thought that someone else's brain was inside his body. He claimed the brain belonged to a girl named Denise, and she wanted to take full control of him. His doctors explained all of this as mere illusions, but Victor was convinced otherwise. He felt like he had touched both the devil and angels, so he wasn't ready to let go of his beliefs. But as time went on, Victor realized that if he kept insisting that he was seeing the devil, he'd never get out of the hospital. So he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. He wanted to get better, to live a life without fear, and to leave the constant anxiety behind. The doctors started him on a treatment plan that included electroconvulsive therapy, 12 sessions in total, tranquilizers, occupational therapy, and supportive psychotherapy. By the end of his treatment, doctors believed that Victor had come to terms with the idea that all the devil sightings were just figments of his imagination. Victor seemed to buy into this too, as he no longer feared the devil and his mind appeared clearer than ever before. He was happy and cooperative, though still somewhat withdrawn and inclined to be alone at times. But here's the catch. Even though Victor was no longer scared of the devil, his darker impulses didn't go away. He still had violent thoughts, imagining killing his family and people around him for no reason other than the simple desire to do so. He openly shared these impulses with his doctors, and they were aware of them. Despite this, they were optimistic about his recovery. They told his father that he would be fine in a year or two, with some more therapy. So, despite knowing about Victor's dangerous impulses, the doctors discharged him from the hospital on July 26, 1967. They sent him back home to his father, along with a prescription for tranquilizers, hoping that this would keep him calm and prevent any further dangerous behavior. But life at home didn't exactly go as planned. Victor had a tough time adjusting back to life on the farm. He was surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of home, but something felt wrong. His mind was still clouded, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the world wasn't the same as it had been before his hospitalization. The medication prescribed to him didn't help much either. In fact, it made things worse. The tranquilizers made him feel incredibly sleepy, which interfered with his work on the farm. On top of that, his back hurt constantly, adding to his growing frustration. By August 8th, Victor had had enough of the medication. He complained that the tranquilizers made him feel weak and useless, and he desperately wanted to get back to his normal routine. He needed to feel strong again, especially to be able to help on the farm. So he made a choice. He stopped taking the pills. At first, he didn't notice any drastic changes. But a few days later, something shifted within him. On August 11th, Victor woke up with an unsettling feeling. It wasn't like the usual emotions he felt on a bad day. This was different. He had a strong sense that something was about to happen, but he couldn't explain why. All he knew was that he felt like he would either end up back in the hospital or in jail. Victor's biggest fear was going back to the hospital. The idea of being locked away again terrified him, and he said he'd rather die than face that fate. In his mind, he had been suffering for so long, and the hospital was just a place where people didn't understand him. He believed that the worst part wasn't the treatments or the isolation. It was being trapped in a place where no one could see what was really going on inside his mind. Victor had always felt different, and he began to believe that he had a special ability. He called it visions. These weren't just regular dreams or daydreams, though. According to Victor, these visions were a way of seeing the future. He believed that these premonitions had been happening for as long as he could remember, and they would come to him every day. And with each vision, there was always the same unsettling feeling. After seeing the future, he would imagine killing someone. It was as if this act would somehow prove to the devil that he was finally on his side, that he wasn't afraid to do whatever it took. On August 14th, Victor's day started off pretty normally. He spent the day working on the tractor, trying to keep himself busy and occupied. But by 9:30 p.m., he was exhausted. He fell asleep on the sofa, but around 11:30 p.m., his parents woke him up and asked him to go to his bedroom. He went back to sleep but woke up again around 3 a.m., unable to rest any longer. It was then that he decided to go to the garage and try to distract himself with some work. But after working for a while, he still couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness. So he began pacing back and forth in the garage, letting his mind wander. That's when something strange happened. As Victor stood by the garage door, he suddenly felt a strange sensation in the side of his head. It wasn't painful, more like a sudden rush of pleasure. He described it as if his body had been sliced in half and something had left him. It wasn't a feeling of pain but more like release. It was as if all the tension and fear he had been holding on to suddenly vanished. But in its place, the urge to kill grew even stronger. The feeling surged through him, taking over his mind. With this new, overwhelming urge to kill, Victor decided he needed to do something about it. He grabbed his .22 Browning pump-action repeater rifle and loaded it up. He wasn't thinking clearly, but all he knew was that he needed to act. His plan was simple. He would drive around for about an hour, look for small rodents to hunt, and then head back home to finish his chores. He was looking for squirrels, particularly those living in the spruce trees around his farm. But as he drove for what felt like an eternity, he found no squirrels. No small animals at all. Victor could have taken that as a sign to turn around, but something inside him kept him going. The thought of killing wouldn't leave him. He couldn't ignore the pull to find something, someone to take his frustration out on. He kept driving, passing house after house. It wasn't until around 6 a.m. when the sky was starting to brighten that he came across a simple farmhouse. It didn't look any different from the dozens of other houses he had passed along the way, but for some reason the feeling inside him became stronger. It was as if this place was calling to him. Unfortunately, the farmhouse where Victor ended up was home to the Peterson family, who lived in Shell Lake, about 40 miles away from Victor's place in Lesk. Unlike Victor's troubled life, the Peterson household was filled with joy and laughter. They were a big, close-knit family with 10 members in total. At the heart of the family was James Peterson, a hard-working, humble man who was all about community. After serving in World War II, James bought 328 acres of land and became a mixed grain and cattle farmer. But life wasn't easy, and when his father retired, James took on an additional 72 acres, making his workload even heavier. Back then in Canada, it wasn't uncommon for families to be large, and the Petersons were no different. They had 9 kids, ranging from the oldest, Kathy, who was 19, down to the youngest, Larry, who was just 1. The rest of the children were Jean, 17, Mary, 13, Dorothy, 11, Pearl, 9, Phyllis, 4, William, 5, and Colin, 2. The Peterson kids were known as well-behaved, polite, and liked by everyone around them. The whole family had a reputation for being good, respectable folks. They were an ordinary, church-going family, and honestly, no one had anything bad to say about them. Kathy was the only one who wasn't living at home at the time. She had recently gotten married and moved to British Columbia with her husband. The rest of the Petersons lived together in a modest, cozy farmhouse with just 4 rooms. Out of those, only 2 were used as bedrooms. The kids all slept together in one room, except for the 1-year-old baby, who shared a bed with James and Evelyn. It was crowded, but they made it work. They weren't rich by any means, but the Petersons never complained. They cherished what they had, especially their family. James and Evelyn were totally focused on their kids and built a home around them. They loved their children above all else and wanted the best for them. Their oldest daughter, Jean, was an up-and-coming athlete, and her parents were determined to support her talent. So, to help pay for a track camp she wanted to attend in Dundon, James decided to call up his neighbor, Drew Lang. He needed help hauling 50 bushels of hay to the grain elevator to sell the next morning, on August 15, 1967. The very same day that Victor, at that moment, was feeling the uncontrollable urge to kill. According to interviews from his trial, the voices in Victor's head were loud and clear, telling him, "This is it. This is where you have to go and do it." Now, to his surprise, he allegedly recognized the kitchen, despite never having been there before or even knowing the Petersons. Felt so familiar, like he'd seen it in a dream before. Not long after entering, he was confronted by James Peterson, who, not knowing who Victor was or why he was there, lunged toward him, trying to protect his family. James fought back, but Victor was too fast. He shot James 7 times as he tried to shield his loved ones. Afterward, Victor went back outside to reload his gun and gather his thoughts. But as he stood there, he saw Evelyn, James's wife, climbing out of a window with their youngest son, Larry, in her arms. Without hesitation, he shot Evelyn and left her where she fell, motionless. Victor didn't stop there. He went back inside the house, where the Peterson children were still asleep in their beds. One by one, he shot and killed 6 of them: Jean, Mary, Dorothy, Pearl, William, and Colin, at close range while they lay defenseless. The children had no chance. He then returned to where Evelyn's lifeless body lay and took Larry's life as well. He later claimed it was a mercy killing, reasoning that the young boy was too little to survive alone. Victor's twisted reasoning didn't stop there. Since he'd already killed James, he felt there was no reason to leave anyone alive to identify him. So, he set about collecting as many spent cartridge cases as he could find, making sure there was nothing left behind that could tie him to the scene. After the horrific act, Victor made his way back to his own parents' house. He arrived around 7:30 in the morning, but instead of feeling any sense of relief, he was overcome with sickness and horror at what he had just done. The guilt weighed on him heavily as he spent the rest of the day wrestling with the reality of his actions. Meanwhile, Drew Lang arrived at the Peterson farm, expecting to see James, but James was nowhere to be found. It was getting close to 9 a.m., so Lang, assuming James had slept in, joked to the house, calling out for him. But when he pushed open the door, his casual tone quickly turned into one of shock. Inside, he found James Peterson's lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor. Horrified, Lang quickly backed away and rushed to his car. He drove to the nearest phone, a good 4 miles down the road, to make the call that would change everything. The peaceful morning in Shell Lake was shattered, and the Peterson family's lives, along with everyone in the surrounding area, would never be the same. When the police arrived at the Peterson farmhouse, they wasted no time. They rushed in, scanning the home for any survivors and clues that could help them understand what had happened. But the scene they found was chilling. There were no signs of a robbery, and everything appeared untouched. It seemed like there was no clear motive for the murders. Inside, they found 28 bullets, with 27 of them having hit their targets. It was clear that the killings were deliberate, not random. Boot prints were also discovered on the kitchen's linoleum floor, but oddly, no boots from the Peterson home matched the prints. Alongside that, 5 cartridge casings were found, confirming that a .22 caliber weapon had been used. Then, just as they were starting their investigation, something eerie happened. A muffled noise broke the silence. They traced the sound to one of the beds, where, hidden under the sheets and wedged between the bodies of her sisters, they found 4-year-old Phyllis. She was the only survivor of the horrifying massacre. At first, she didn't fully understand what had happened, but she could sense the severity of the situation. Later, she recalled how the officer who carried her from the house was crying. That was when she knew something truly terrible had taken place. Phyllis's survival was a miracle, and her story would haunt everyone who heard it. The massacre of the Peterson family became one of the most gruesome crime scenes many officers had ever witnessed. Phyllis was taken to her uncle's house nearby, while Kathy, her older sister, was notified of the tragedy. Devastated, Kathy moved back to Shell Lake to care for her surviving sister. As the police investigated, they combed through the tall grass and fields surrounding the farm, hoping to find something, anything, that might give them a lead. Roadblocks were set up, and the search for the killer expanded across the area, growing larger with each passing day. They spent days searching, with dogs and a search party of 250 people scouring the land, but nothing turned up. Then, on the 4th day, they caught a break. A local resident from Lesquay, concerned about the tragedy, walked into the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment office in Shellbrook. The resident suggested they look into a young man, the son of his neighbor, who had recently been discharged from a mental hospital. The man had a known obsession with guns and hunting, which immediately raised red flags. The corporal and his team didn't hesitate. They quickly got in their cars and drove down the narrow, winding highways toward Lesquay, their destination, the farm owned by the Hoffman family. They had a hunch this might be the lead they were desperately looking for. They started by questioning Victor's parents, focusing specifically on any firearms, boots, and, of course, their son. As the investigation went on, things started to add up. A rifle was found on the Hoffman's property, and although it wasn't the exact model they originally expected, it was still significant. The police had it sent for ballistics testing to see if it matched the bullets from the Peterson home. During the search, the detectives also spotted a pair of rubber boots. These boots were sent for comparison too, and when the results came back, it was clear. Both the rifle and the boots matched evidence found at the Peterson house. It wasn't long before they had enough evidence to make an arrest. Victor Hoffman was charged with brutal murders of 9 members of the Peterson family. When the arrest was made, there was something chilling about Victor's demeanor. Described by police as a single, average-build man, he didn't seem afraid at all. In fact, he was eerily calm and surrendered without any resistance. His arrest happened just 3 hours after the funeral for the Petersons, adding a whole new layer of shock and horror to the case. Victor was taken to the station in North Battleford, and for the first 10 to 15 minutes, he was silent, not saying a word. But eventually, he broke down. What came next was even more disturbing. Victor confessed to everything. He admitted that the devil made him kill the Petersons. But perhaps the most unsettling part of his confession came when he was asked about Phyllis, the only survivor. Victor claimed that he spared Phyllis because she had the face of an angel. As for the others, he said he didn't respect them because they looked like pigs. These chilling responses raised serious concerns about Victor's mental state, so instead of being sent to a regular prison, he was taken to a nearby mental hospital for further evaluation. There, doctors diagnosed him once again with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that had clearly gone untreated. Despite this, the court found that he was still fit to stand trial. Victor's trial began on January 8, 1968, and his charges were 2 counts of non-capital murder. The defense team argued that Victor wouldn't have committed the horrific crime if it hadn't been for his untreated mental illness. They stood firm, insisting that his condition played a central role in the tragedy. After deliberating for 3.5 hours, the jury reached a verdict. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Victor, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity. The decision stunned many and left people questioning how someone who had confessed to such a brutal crime could escape the full weight of justice. But the jury's decision was based on something that many hadn't expected at the time of Victor's mental health. The doctor who had testified for the defense had given such a detailed and logical explanation of Victor's mental illness that the jury felt convinced. They understood that Victor was driven by something that, in his mind, felt real. His paranoia and delusions had played a major role in what happened, and that convinced the jury that he truly believed he was doing what he thought was necessary. Although Victor wouldn't spend the rest of his life in prison, the judge made sure he didn't get off easy. Instead of a typical prison sentence, Victor was committed to an institution for the criminally insane. This seemed to hurt him even more. After hearing the verdict, he just sat there, looking straight ahead, showing absolutely no emotion. It was as if the reality of his situation hadn't hit him yet. Victor was sent to a facility in southern Ontario where he would stay indefinitely, with his release depending on government regulations. 4 years, he remained in that institution, out of the public eye, until December of 2001, when he was granted supervised access to nearby towns. But even this small amount of freedom didn't last long. Victor would never experience true freedom again. On May 21, 2004, Victor died in custody from cancer, but the aftermath of his crimes would linger for much longer. Kathy, the sister of one of the victims, took on the responsibility of raising Phyllis, the only survivor of the massacre. She raised Phyllis alongside her own children, giving her a second chance at life after the horrors she had experienced. Eventually, Kathy and her husband retired from farming and moved to a nearby town after their family farmhouse burned down. But despite the years that had passed, both Kathy and Phyllis couldn't shake their frustrations about what happened. Phyllis had been a little girl when the massacre occurred, and as she grew up, she still struggled with the shadow of the tragedy. She spoke about how difficult it was to live with the unwanted attention that came with being the only survivor. People looked at her differently, and it was hard to escape the weight of the past. In an interview in 2004, Phyllis opened up about her struggles. She said, "It was always hard to adjust, always feeling like I didn't fit in, until I had my son, James." Having James was a turning point for Phyllis. It helped her heal in ways she never thought possible. Sadly, Phyllis passed away from cancer in May of 2019. A Canadian journalist named Peter Tadman wrote a book titled The Shell Lake Massacre, where he covered the details of the case. In the book, Peter interviewed Victor several times, and he reported that Victor stood firm in his belief that he didn't feel any guilt for his actions. He even claimed that he still saw the devil who had compelled him to murder so many innocent people. To this day, the Peterson Massacre remains one of Canada's most horrific random killings, second only to the Portapique Massacre in 2020, where 22 innocent lives were taken. While the insanity ruling in Victor's case is something we can't ignore, it's definitely a tough one to digest. Just because someone is deemed insane doesn't mean their actions can be justified. No innocent life should ever be lost, no matter the circumstances. But let's be real. None of this would have happened if Victor hadn't been released from the mental hospital in the first place. Story 4. This was the kind of family every man dreamed of having. Amarjeet Chauhan had it all. A loving wife, adorable kids, and a thriving business worth £5 million. But just 2 days after that joyful family video was taken, they disappeared without a single clue. And it leaves you wondering, why would a happy family vanish? Could it be anything other than murder? What unfolded next sent chills through even the most hardened detectives. Police would later call this case one of the most horrifying and unique crimes they'd ever encountered. So unbelievable, it seemed like something out of a twisted thriller. The mastermind behind it came dangerously close to outsmarting the law, and by the end of the story, you'll be left stunned at how this chilling mystery was finally unraveled. To really get a sense of the story, let's take a trip back to the early 2000s, specifically 2003, and head to Heathrow, a bustling area in the United Kingdom. It was here that a thriving business called Saba Freight was making waves in the fruit import world. This wasn't just your average company, it was a booming empire. At the center of it all was a 46-year-old man named Amarjeet Chauhan. Most people called him Anil. Anil's journey was nothing short of inspiring. He was born in India but moved to the UK in his early 20s with big dreams of building a better life, and let me tell you, he absolutely crushed it. He worked hard, climbed the ladder of success, and eventually became the proud owner of Saba Freight, a business worth millions. But life wasn't just about business for Anil. He had a beautiful family that he adored. Anil was married to Nancy, a stunning woman who was 20 years younger than him. Together, they had 2 little boys, Devinder and Ravinder. Their home was full of love and laughter. Nancy's mother also lived with them, partly to keep Nancy company and partly to help out since Nancy had just given birth to their second son, Ravinder. Now this family of 5 had everything you could ask for: love, success, and a bright future ahead of them. You could see how happy they were in the video footage shown in the intro. Smiles all around, kids playing, and a couple deeply in love. Life seemed picture perfect. But even with all this success, Nancy had one thing on her mind: home. She missed India deeply. The culture, the familiarity, the memories. It all pulled at her heart. She often brought it up with Anil, telling him how much she wanted to move back. She believed India's education system was better for their boys and felt they could build an even happier life there. So, she wanted Anil to sell the business and start fresh in their homeland. Anil, on the other hand, wasn't one to rush big decisions like that, especially when it came to the business he had poured his heart and soul into. Now, if you ask anyone who worked for Anil, they'd tell you he was the kind of boss everyone wanted. He was known for being kind-hearted, generous, and laid back. In interviews with his team, they spoke warmly about how approachable he was. But like everyone, Anil had a past. Back in 1996, he had a run-in with the law and ended up spending 3 years in jail for tax evasion. It was a tough time, but instead of letting it define him, he used it as motivation to turn his life around. Once he was out, he poured all his energy into rebuilding his career and creating the successful empire that Saba Freight had become by the early 2000s. Fast forward to 2003, and this is where things take an interesting turn. A man named Kenneth Reagan showed up, applying for a position at Anil's company. However, Kenneth wasn't your average job applicant. He was an ex-convict with a history of smuggling drugs. At first, Anil was hesitant about hiring him. But then, he thought about his own past. If he could thrive after a rough patch, why not give Kenneth the same chance? So, Anil decided to hire Kenneth, giving him a fresh start as a driver. First, everything seemed fine. Kenneth blended in with the team, and the other employees noticed nothing out of the ordinary. It was business as usual at Saba Freight. However, around this time, Anil was seriously considering Nancy's wish to move back to India. He had been mulling over the idea of selling the business. And then, as if on cue, Kenneth came in with some interesting news. Kenneth claimed he knew someone who was willing to buy the company, and not just buy it, but pay £3 million in cash. Naturally, this offer piqued Anil's interest. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to fulfill his wife's dream of returning to their homeland, while also making a hefty sum from the sale of his business. So, on a seemingly ordinary day, February 13, 2003, Anil left his office, supposedly heading to Wiltshire to meet with this mysterious buyer. The deal sounded promising, but here's the strange part. He didn't tell anyone exactly where he was going, or even share the name of the person he was planning to meet. It was as if he trusted Kenneth's word without question, eager to explore what seemed like the perfect solution to his family's plans. But then, Anil didn't return that evening. It was as though he had simply vanished into thin air. Nancy was starting to feel more and more anxious as the night went on. She had called the company, hoping to find some clue about Anil's whereabouts. But as expected, no one had seen him. Just as she was about to panic, her phone buzzed. It was a voice message from Anil. In the message, he told her not to worry, that he was fine, and that he couldn't make it home that night. He promised he would be back the following day. But something about it didn't sit right with Nancy. This wasn't how Anil normally communicated. She and her husband always spoke to each other in Punjabi. But the message she just received? It was in English. "Hello, Nancy. Don't panic. I'm okay. I'll be back tomorrow." The words sounded like Anil, but they didn't sound like him. That's when she decided to call her brother Unkar, who lived miles away in New Zealand. Unkar was a journalist, and though he hadn't seen Nancy or their mother in nearly 9 years, they still spoke almost every day. She trusted him completely and needed someone to talk to. But that call with Unkar would turn out to be the last time he ever heard from his sister. 4 days after that, on February 17, 2003, Kenneth made a shocking announcement at work. He told everyone that Anil had sold the company to a woman named Belinda Bruin. To back up this claim, he produced a letter stating that Anil had sold Saba Freight and was retiring abroad with Nancy due to ill health. The letter even had Anil's signature on it. The news took everyone by surprise. No one had expected such a major change, and naturally, the employees were now worried about their jobs with the arrival of a new owner. However, the reality of working in a busy company meant that they didn't have much time to stop and dwell on the situation. There was no time to question the announcement or voice their concerns. Everyone just had to keep working and adjust to the sudden shift, unsure of what the future held. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, Unkar, Nancy's brother, was growing increasingly concerned. After a routine missing persons inquiry, it was discovered that the family home was empty. Neighbors and colleagues all seemed to believe that the Chauhans had simply packed up and moved back to India, as Nancy had wanted. But Unkar wasn't convinced. He knew that Nancy or his mom wouldn't go anywhere without telling him. So if the police couldn't find any answers, he figured he would take matters into his own hands. He decided to fly to the UK and investigate his family's disappearance himself. Alone in a foreign place, Unkar arrived in Hounslow, the family's hometown, and headed straight for the Chauhan house. What he discovered there would shock him to the core, and it set him on a path that no one could have predicted. With compelling evidence that his family had left the house against their will, Unkar didn't waste any time. He went straight to the police, determined to get them to take action. After presenting his findings, he managed to convince the authorities to launch a full investigation into the mysterious disappearance of the Chauhan family. The case was handed over to DCI Andy Rowell, a seasoned investigator who wasted no time in getting to work. Rowell's first step? Interviewing the last person known to have seen Anil Chauhan on the day he vanished, Kenneth Reagan. Now, as mentioned earlier, Kenneth Reagan was no ordinary man. In fact, he had a whole collection of names. He was also known as Ken Avery, but perhaps the most intriguing nickname he had was Captain Cash. The story behind that was simple but chilling. He was said to always carry around hefty sums of cash, often tucked into a case, making him a figure known in the underworld for his money and shady dealings. Before he became a part of Saba Freight, Reagan had quite a notorious past. Back in the late 90s, he was a career criminal, and not just any criminal. He was deep into the world of organized crime, running freight companies around the Heathrow area. But these companies were not just legitimate businesses. No, they were carefully crafted fronts for smuggling drugs into the country. Reagan knew the ins and outs of the criminal world and had connections with some of the most powerful and dangerous criminal families in London. At the time, Kenneth Reagan was living the high life, surrounded by criminals and making his money in all the wrong ways. He was enjoying the luxuries of his illegal activities, flashy clothes, expensive watches, and always rolling with a crowd of shady figures. But it was at a fashionable London bar where Reagan's world collided with that of Belinda Bruin, the same woman who would later allegedly buy the company from Anil. Back then, she was a celebrity agent and socialite, living in the fast lane of the social scene. Belinda described Reagan as a bit rough around the edges, not well-educated, but charming in his own way. She saw him as the classic rich wide boy type, the kind of guy who thought his money could buy him class. As time went on, Reagan became fixated on Belinda. His obsession started when he began calling and emailing her relentlessly, saying things like, "I haven't felt like this in 30 years, you're like a drug." Rumors soon started circulating that they were in a relationship, though that was never officially confirmed. But on June 17, 1998, Reagan's world came crashing down. He was caught with 25 kilograms of heroin, a massive stash. Facing a daunting 18 years in prison, Reagan quickly made a deal to turn on his former associates and became a grass. His testimony led to the conviction of 12 major criminals, and in return, his sentence was reduced. For years later, when he was released from prison, Reagan found himself with nothing. His assets had been seized through a confiscation order, leaving him in a small one-bedroom bungalow with his father. Despite his fall from grace, Reagan wasn't ready to give up on his criminal ways. He was determined to make a comeback, and the perfect opportunity came in the form of Anil Chauhan's thriving freight company. Reagan saw it as the perfect front for his drug-dealing operations. Once again, he was planning to use a legitimate business to cover up his illegal activities. By this time, Belinda Bruin had given up her house in Chelsea for a fresh start in Devon. Reagan's obsessive calls and letters had stopped during his 4 years in prison, but now that he was free, he began to pursue her once again. A few weeks after his release, Reagan left Belinda a series of messages on her mobile, flirting with her. But in January of 2003, he left a message that piqued her curiosity, claiming he had a business deal he wanted to discuss. At the time, Belinda was dealing with personal struggles. She had a huge house, a large mortgage, 2 kids in private school, and her boyfriend had just left her. She decided to call him back. Reagan told Belinda he was planning to take over Saba Freight and needed a new managing director. Although she had no experience in the field, Reagan offered her a huge salary for just a 2-day work week. At first, he offered her £54,000, which she thought wasn't enough to cover her expenses. He quickly increased the offer to £72,000, which seemed more appealing. This job offer gave Reagan a convenient excuse to visit Belinda at her isolated home in Devon. He'd come up with bizarre reasons for needing her help with forms or letters, and he would drive all the way from Salisbury or London just for a brief visit. Reagan seemed increasingly fixated on the land around Belinda's farm, constantly complaining about the mud in the lane and suggesting ways to improve the property, like cutting down trees and building a wall with electric gates. Fast forward to February, 1 month after Reagan had told Belinda about the job offer, and things were finally falling into place. Belinda was given a desk and a computer, and she began reviewing the company's books as Reagan had instructed. However, on her second day, she felt unwell and decided to drive home to Devon instead of going to work. When she arrived, she was shocked to see a battered Jaguar and 2 men in her field with a digger. The men were William Hornsey and Peter Reese, both associates of Reagan. Belinda was furious and demanded to know what they were doing. They explained they were building a drainage ditch. Belinda couldn't believe it. It wasn't just the ditch, it was the fact that they had done this without her permission. Reagan arrived and tried to justify the digging by saying, "I thought you'd appreciate it." Belinda was livid. She made it clear that it was her land and they had no right to dig it up. Though she planned to have it removed, she was told to wait until summer. By 2003, Reagan was on the brink of reclaiming his former millionaire lifestyle. He had taken control of Saba Freight, Anil Chauhan's former company, which now served as an ideal front for his drug-dealing operations. For years, Reagan had obsessively pursued Belinda Bruin from afar, and now she was on his payroll. It seemed as though Reagan's dreams were finally coming true, but the dark secret behind his success was about to be exposed. When detectives sat down with Kenneth Reagan to ask about the Chauhan family, they were met with a story that seemed almost too perfect. Reagan painted Anil Chauhan as a desperate businessman, drowning in financial woes and unable to sell his business. His version of events suggested that, with no other options left, Chauhan had simply vanished into thin air. It was a convenient narrative, but one the detectives weren't willing to buy. Using cutting-edge forensic technology, the investigators tracked both Reagan and Chauhan's mobile phone movements on the day of the disappearance. What they uncovered was nothing short of chilling. Chauhan's phone, initially traced to the Hounslow area, suddenly pinged in the Stonehenge area just days after his disappearance. This wasn't far from Reagan's home in Wilton, Salisbury, and the detectives quickly connected the dots. Reagan's phone had met up with Chauhan's in that very location. From there, the 2 phones traveled south, moving toward Exeter in the West Country, a path that seemed more than coincidental. But the detectives' pursuit didn't stop there. They found a lead that seemed almost too unlikely to ignore. Devon, the home of Belinda Bruin, the newly appointed managing director of Saba. The police planned to visit her, thinking she might know more than she was letting on. However, just when they were about to get answers, a tip arrived from a man named William Hornsey, an associate of Reagan. Hornsey claimed to have important information about Chauhan's whereabouts, stating that Chauhan was very much alive and on the run. Hornsey's revelation that he was meeting Chauhan in Newport to hand over stolen passports seemed like the break the detectives had been waiting for. They rushed to Newport, heading straight to the location Hornsey had described, the iconic bronze pig statue near the passport office. There they found Hornsey and Reagan standing nervously, but something wasn't right. It was as if they were trying to spin the story into something else. Hornsey and Reagan claimed that Chauhan couldn't make it because, allegedly, he had somehow discovered that they were meeting with the police. The detectives, trying to piece things together, attempted to trace the phone Chauhan supposedly used, but their efforts were in vain. The number led to an unregistered phone, and once again, they were left with nothing but frustration and the sinking feeling that they were being misled, pulled further into a web of lies. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Back at Saba, Reagan resumed his work like nothing had happened, as if he wasn't at the center of an investigation. But the detectives weren't about to let this slip through the cracks. They called Belinda in for questioning, determined to get to the bottom of things. When Reagan learned that Belinda was being questioned, his anger flared. He immediately warned her, telling her that if the police ever asked about his work on her property, she was to simply say he was helping with her water system. So on the day of the questioning, Belinda answered every question the detectives threw at her. But when it seemed like the interview was wrapping up, the detectives asked her if there was anything unusual about Reagan's behavior. That's when Belinda hesitated before mentioning one peculiar detail. Reagan had told her that if the police asked about him, she should say he was just helping with her water system. That one statement threw the detectives off. Without a moment's hesitation, they rushed to Devon, convinced that something grisly awaited them at Belinda's farm. They meticulously excavated the dig site where Reagan had been working, conducting an exhaustive forensic search. Forensic archaeologists and pathologists worked tirelessly, but after 5 long days of digging, no bodies were uncovered. At this point, it seemed like they were hitting a dead end. No physical evidence tied Reagan to any crime, and the case was on the verge of becoming a cold one. That is, until April of 2003, when a father and son duo decided to go on a leisurely evening paddle near Bournemouth Pier. As they glided through the water, something caught their eye. A bloated, lifeless body floating just beneath the surface. The body was unnervingly large and bloated, the feet floating above the water while the torso and face were submerged. The son immediately called emergency services, unable to shake the sight of the floating corpse. For nearly 3 long hours, the father stayed there, making sure the body would be found and the situation wouldn't go unnoticed. In an interview, he later recalled how that moment gave him absolute chills through his spine. The body was taken to a mortuary in Bournemouth, but it would be nearly a week before the authorities could confirm the unthinkable. It was indeed Anil Chauhan, the missing businessman. But the truth was far more chilling than anyone had imagined. An autopsy revealed a horrifying sequence of events. Anil had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of his head, a brutal blow that had left him unconscious. But it didn't end there. Packing tape had been wrapped tightly around his mouth, clear evidence of suffocation after the head injury. The forensic experts concluded that the combination of the blow to his head and the suffocation was the likely cause of his tragic death. While the police were still processing this shocking discovery, the search for more evidence pressed on. This time, investigators were zeroing in on Belinda Bruin's farm in Devon, hoping to find something that would link all the pieces together. And they did. As they dug deeper, they uncovered burnt clothes, jewelry, and even some hairs buried in the soil, clues that pointed to a burial site on Belinda's land. After forensic testing, it was confirmed. The hairs belonged to Anil Chauhan, and it became clear he had been murdered, buried at the farm, dug up later, and dumped into the sea near Bournemouth. The size of the excavation site raised even more questions. If they were just trying to hide one body, why dig such a large area? The detectives uncovered more clues, including jewelry that seemed to belong to Nancy, Anil's wife, and small poppers from baby clothes. It was a chilling realization. Anil's entire family might have been buried there too. With this new evidence, the investigation shifted gears. The case was upgraded to a Category A murder inquiry, the highest priority level. From then on, Kenneth Reagan was the prime suspect. But both he and his associate, William Hornsey, had mysteriously disappeared. One day, as Belinda was driving home, she noticed something strange. A familiar car parked near her property. Her heart sank when she realized it belonged to Reagan and Hornsey. There was no mistaking it. They were back, and it wasn't a casual visit. These were the same men she believed had dug a mysterious ditch on her land. A ditch she suspected was used to hide bodies. Her instincts screamed that something was off, but she stayed calm. Smiling nervously, she told them she needed to grab something from her shed and would return in a couple of minutes. The moment she was out of their sight, Belinda bolted to her car, heart racing, and sped off. She called the police immediately, describing the situation in detail. Officers were dispatched to her home, but by the time they arrived, Reagan and Hornsey were gone. Not a single clue was left behind. That was the last time anyone ever saw the two men. But the story didn't end there. Days after the Chauhan family had vanished, Belinda remembered something critical. There had been 3 men on her property that day. That meant someone else was still out there, and she was convinced it was Peter Reese. Now on his own, Reese was left to wrestle with the weight of his choices. As the days turned into weeks, guilt began to consume him. He bounced between hostels and boarding houses, always looking over his shoulder, knowing the police were closing in. One evening, while staying at a small boarding house, Reese struck up a conversation with the landlady. In a moment of weakness, he confessed everything. "Have you seen me on TV?" he asked her. When she said no, he unloaded the horrifying truth. He admitted that he was involved in covering up the disappearance and murder of an entire family. Reese insisted he hadn't killed anyone, but he admitted to helping hide the bodies. He even painted a chilling picture of Reagan, calling him a psycho who had personally shot 2 babies. The landlady, shocked and terrified, knew she had to act. As soon as she had the chance, she alerted the authorities. Within 12 days, the police caught up to Reese. He was still on the run, moving from place to place like a shadow. But even after his earlier confession, Reese refused to cooperate. He wouldn't share any details about the murders or reveal where the victims were buried, leaving the authorities with more questions than answers. While the police were interrogating Reese, they received shocking news. A fisherman had discovered a decomposed body floating in the water. The body was so deteriorated that the police hesitated to show it to Unkar, fearing it would be too traumatizing. But Unkar insisted it was his baby sister, Nancy. He couldn't imagine not seeing her one last time, even though this was the first time he'd see her in 9 years. And it was after her death, 2 months after the disappearance. The police finally found Kenneth Reagan hiding in Belgium. They brought him back to England to face justice. Surprisingly, 6 weeks after Reagan's arrest, William Hornsey voluntarily turned himself in to the authorities. With Peter Reese already in custody, all 3 suspects were now under police watch. However, none of them cooperated. They stayed silent, refusing to answer questions or share details that could tie them to the crime. Even with all 3 men in custody, the police were still missing something crucial. Nancy's mother and her 2 babies hadn't been found. Without strong evidence, the police couldn't make a solid case for conviction. They needed more clues to ensure justice. That's when they decided to dig into the suspect's phone records, especially on the day Amarjeet met Reagan at Stonehenge. What they found painted a grim picture. The records showed all 3 men traveling south to Salisbury, stopping at an apartment located at 3 Forge Close, the address of Kenneth Reagan's home. The detective who led the investigation pieced together an alarming timeline. During the time Anil Chauhan was missing, at least one of the 3 men was always at Reagan's apartment. This led detectives to believe Anil was being held captive there, guarded round the clock to ensure he couldn't escape. It was during this time that the 2 men carried out their cruel plan, abducting the entire family from their home. The police believed that Anil was killed at Reagan's apartment, while Nancy, her mother Chiranjit, and the 2 babies met their tragic end in Hounslow. Despite this horrifying theory, the evidence the police had was purely circumstantial. They had no solid proof linking the suspects directly to the murders, and without it, their case remained shaky. When detectives searched Kenneth Reagan's apartment, they found no signs of a struggle or violence. The place had been meticulously cleaned and redecorated. Reagan had installed new carpets, replaced the couch covers, and made it seem as if nothing sinister had ever happened there. He had wiped away nearly all traces of what could have been crucial evidence. At this point, while the investigation strongly pointed to Reagan and his associates, the jury needed more than just theories and suspicions to convict them. The entire nation was watching the case unfold, gripped by the horror of what had happened to this innocent family. People across the country demanded justice for Anil, Nancy, their 2 young children, and Nancy's mother. Yet, with each passing day, hope seemed to dim as investigators struggled to find that one solid piece of evidence. Just when it seemed like the case might fall apart, a breakthrough came, one that no one could have anticipated. This pivotal moment came from Anil Chauhan himself. Even in death, when his body was discovered, every item of clothing he was wearing was carefully preserved by forensic investigators. His shirt, pants, and shoes were thoroughly examined, but nothing was found at first. Months passed, and it seemed like the evidence they needed simply wasn't there. Then, 8 months after Anil's body was recovered, investigators took another look at his socks, and that's when they made a startling discovery. Tightly folded and hidden inside his sock was a single piece of paper. It was a letter dated February 12, 2003, the exact day Anil had disappeared. The letter was addressed to Kenneth Reagan at 3 Forge Close, Reagan's home address. Investigators believed that while Anil was being held captive, he realized he wouldn't survive. In his final desperate moments, he thought of a way to leave behind a clue that would point to his killer. He folded the letter over and over again until it was small enough to hide in his sock, hoping it would remain undiscovered by his captors. The letter survived Anil's burial, the time his body spent in the water, and the months it took for investigators to find it. It was a testament to Anil's incredible courage and determination to seek justice for himself and his family, even when he knew he wouldn't live to see it. With the letter in hand, the case against Reagan, Reese, and Hornsey was solid. No jury could deny their involvement in the horrific murders. The trial began in 2005, 2 years after the crimes. It was one of the longest and most chilling criminal trials in the history of England's Central Criminal Court. The proceedings revealed the depth of Reagan's greed and cruelty, and the lengths he was willing to go to cover his tracks. Peter Reese, who had played a supporting role in the crimes, was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kenneth Reagan and William Hornsey, the masterminds of the plan, each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never walk free again. Peter Reese, who had played a supporting role in the crimes, was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kenneth Reagan and William Hornsey, the masterminds of the plan, each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never walk free again. As the investigation continued, more heartbreaking discoveries were made. The body of Nancy's mother, Chiranjit Kaur, was found off the coast of the Isle of Wight. Like Anil and Nancy, she had been drowned. However, the bodies of the 2 youngest victims, 1-year-old Devinder and 8-week-old Ravinder, were never recovered. Though justice was served in the courtroom, the emotional scars left behind were immeasurable. Ankar, Nancy's brother, carried the weight of grief and unanswered questions. In an interview, Ankar couldn't hold back his tears as he wondered what his family had endured in their final moments and whether they had held on to hope for rescue. This case remains one of the most horrific crimes ever, with the sheer brutality of it all sending chills down the spine. What makes it even more disturbing is the innocence of the family involved, their lives cruelly taken in such a violent manner. The idea that 2 young children were caught in the middle of this violence is almost too much to comprehend. Story 5. They say kindness is the best gift you can give. But what if that gift turns into your worst nightmare? That's exactly what happened when Janice posted this chilling status on Facebook, begging for help, saying she and her siblings were under attack. What no one knew at the time was that this cry for help would spark one of the most horrifying and shocking cases the Philippines had ever witnessed. The case was so disturbingly gruesome and eerily bizarre that it's compared to a famous movie. And by the time you reach the end of this video, you'll be questioning every act of kindness you've ever given, and just how horrifying it can be when it falls into the wrong hands. To really get the picture, let's head over to the small, quiet town of Malong in North Cotabato, Philippines. It's a place known for its calm vibe and rural charm, where life moves at a slower pace. People here are deeply connected to the land, relying on agriculture for their livelihood, growing staples like rice, corn, and vegetables. In this peaceful town lived the Magwad family. Unlike many others, they led a pretty stable life. Cruz Magwad, the father, was an elementary school teacher. He was well respected and loved by everyone, constantly being praised for his hard work. A promotion was even on the horizon, which meant he was doing pretty well financially. His wife, Lavella, was the principal at the same school. Together they didn't make crazy money, but they were considered one of the more privileged families in town. Their youngest child, Louis, also known as Boy Boy, was 16. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, even at his young age, and he was determined to work hard to get there. Aside from being smart, he was also creative, playing guitar, drawing, and reading in his spare time. Gwen, his older sister, was the more intense one. Super smart, driven, and goal-oriented. She had always been this way. As a kid, she was a Girl Scout, and her sash was covered in so many badges that there was no room for more. Gwen didn't just stop there. She enrolled in a pre-med prep program during high school and planned to become a doctor. By all accounts, Gwen was the type of person who would sit with you at a party if you were feeling shy, sticking by your side until you felt at ease. That's exactly how she met 17-year-old Janice. But unlike Gwen and Luis, Janice's childhood was far from happy. She wasn't privileged enough to attend school and had to work from a very young age. Even worse, she grew up without parents. Her first real memory started when she was around 8 years old. Before that, everything was a blur. She only remembers being found by a stranger, wandering alone on a huge shipping container boat. Her parents were nowhere to be found, and Janice believed they had abandoned her. The stranger was kind enough to post her picture and name online, trying to find her parents. They shared her story on Facebook and various online forums, but no one ever came forward. Eventually, Janice was dropped off at the Philippines version of CPS, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, where she moved from one foster home to another. Not long after, Janice was offered a live-in nanny job by a family. Though she hated the job, she was incredibly grateful for the opportunity. Janice shared all of this with Gwen, and Gwen was so deeply moved by her story that an idea began to form in her mind. An idea that could give Janice the safe, loving home she deserved. Adoption. Gwen, together with Louis, decided to present the idea to their parents like a well-thought-out thesis. They approached the subject with serious dedication, telling their parents that adopting Janice wouldn't just change her life. It would help their family, too. They convinced their parents that Janice could pitch in with the chores around the house, which was a big deal in their Asian family culture. It wasn't uncommon for children to share the responsibility of washing dishes, cleaning, and cooking. With one more set of hands to help, the family would run more smoothly. Gwen's parents weren't exactly rolling in money, but they believed in teaching responsibility. The kids had chores, had to keep their grades up, and attend church every Sunday. They were strict, but it was out of love, and Gwen and Louis respected that. That strong connection gave Gwen and Louis the courage to ask for something as big as adopting Janice. In 2021, Janice moved in, and it was like she was instantly part of the family. The Magwads welcomed her with open arms. Louis even gave up his own room, just so Janice could have a more comfortable one. They enrolled her in school right away, and for the first time, Janice didn't wake up with the constant worry of finding food or going to work. She was finally allowed to be a kid. As Janice settled into her new life, the bond between the three siblings grew stronger by the day. You could see the happiness shining through, especially in the videos they posted on TikTok. Janice even got to experience a family vacation for the first time, something she had always dreamed of. Laughter filled the air as they explored new places together, creating memories she would cherish forever. For once, Janice felt like she belonged to something bigger, something safe, and full of love. But just when everything seemed perfect, Janice's world was about to shatter. On the 10th of December that same year, she posted a series of statuses on Facebook, claiming that she and her siblings were under attack. It was just days before Christmas, a time that should have been filled with joy, but instead, it was the beginning of a nightmare. At that time, Mr. Cruz, the father, was at school, doing some chores related to the upcoming holiday. Lavella, the mother, was away on a work trip, but everything changed when Mr. Cruz received a phone call that left him frozen in terror. The voice on the other end told him that their home was being ransacked, and his children were there. By 3:15 in the afternoon, Cruz finally arrived at the house. It was eerily silent. Outside the front door, his eyes locked onto a blood-soaked blanket on the ground, with a knife nearby. He called out for his kids, but there was no response. He moved quickly to the back door and managed to find a way inside. Cruz moved rapidly through the house, his voice echoing off the walls as he searched for his children. It wasn't until he entered the living room that his worst nightmare became a horrifying reality. There, lying on the floor, was his daughter Gwen. A towel soaked in blood was wrapped around her body. Her limbs and torso were covered in multiple slash wounds, but it was the injuries on her neck that were particularly severe. Crime scene photos later revealed the gruesome extent of the wounds. Her flesh was torn apart, and ants had already begun to gather on her body. Not far from Gwen, near the main door, Cruz found Louis. His hands and feet were bound, and a gag covered his mouth. His body was riddled with fresh stab wounds. The amount of blood suggested the attack had happened just moments before Cruz arrived. But there was one more person missing, Janice. Cruz's heart pounded as he continued to search the house, calling her name. Then, finally, Janice appeared. She emerged from her room, her hair wet, her face pale and shaken. She was in shock, barely able to speak. Seeing her, Cruz immediately called the police. The officers arrived soon after, stepping into a crime scene that would later be described as one of the most gruesome in the Philippines. Blood pooled on the floor, and the house bore the marks of extreme violence. Janice, while trembling, told the officers that they had been attacked. The house was in disarray. Cabinets had been pried open, and personal belongings were scattered across the rooms. At first glance, it seemed like a robbery. However, investigators knew that appearances could be deceiving. They needed to confirm whether anything valuable had been taken to solidify the robbery theory. At the same time, as part of their protocol, the police didn't rule out the parents as persons of interest. They needed to confirm their alibis and whereabouts during the attack. The investigators turned their attention to the room where Janice said she was hiding during the attack. It was messy, but that wasn't unusual for a robbery scene. What stood out, though, were the details that didn't add up. The disarray in the room, though chaotic, didn't have the usual signs of a real robbery. So, the police began to search the house more carefully, and they soon found some crucial evidence. Just outside the front door, the police discovered a blood-stained shirt, which they believed had been dropped by the attacker while trying to escape. And about 100 meters away, they found a plastic bag in a ditch. Inside it were bloody pants and underwear. It seemed like the attacker had deliberately thrown these items away to hide evidence. Inside the house, the scene was increasingly horrifying. Near the front door, officers found a knife with a broken handle, its blade slick with blood. The living room floor was littered with shards of glass and broken bottles, a clear sign of the violence that had unfolded there. Expansive pools of blood painted a grim picture, revealing the brutal nature of the attack. Among the carnage, investigators discovered a discarded machete, a baseball bat, and a hammer, each stained with blood. These weapons were assumed to be used in the murders. Crime scene analysts took careful note of the blood patterns, which provided key insights into the sequence of events. They determined that Gwen, the older sibling, had likely been killed first. Her blood had partially coagulated, and rigor mortis had already begun to set in. In contrast, Lewis's blood appeared much fresher, suggesting he had been murdered shortly after Gwen. The different states of the blood and bodies made this theory even more plausible. Lewis's hands and feet were bound, while Gwen's were not. This discrepancy indicated that Gwen might have been ambushed and killed quickly, while Lewis was restrained, likely to prevent him from resisting before his own murder. The variety of weapons found at the scene, ranging from a broken knife to a machete, baseball bat, and hammer, raised troubling questions for the investigative team. The fact that so many different tools were used, and that the victims had distinctive types of wounds, strongly suggested the involvement of more than one attacker. This theory was supported by the fact that Lewis had been restrained. It would have been difficult for a single person to control a victim while also carrying out such a brutal attack. Adding to the mystery, Cruz, the sibling's father, confirmed that the weapons found at the scene were his. The murderers seemed to have used tools that were readily available in the house, which made the crime even more unsettling. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. As investigators continued to gather evidence, they found something that stood out. The family's laundry machine had been used, but there were no freshly washed clothes anywhere in the house. This odd discovery suggested that something unusual had happened after the crime, perhaps an attempt to erase evidence or cover their tracks. The extreme brutality of the crime prompted local authorities to launch a manhunt for the suspects. The public was shocked, and the need for justice became urgent. To help with the investigation, the vice of the Municipal Council of Malong, North Cotabato, announced a reward of 200,000 pesos for any information leading to the capture of the perpetrators. The mayor also offered an additional 50,000 pesos as a bounty. These actions emphasized the gravity of the case and the community's desperate need for answers. An autopsy was performed on Gwen and Luis, spanning 2 days, starting on December 13, 2021, and the results were chilling. Gwen had sustained 32 stab and slash wounds, some of which were deep enough to almost sever her limbs. One of her ears had been cut off, and her neck and upper arm were nearly severed. Her body also showed signs of blunt force trauma, likely caused by the hammer and baseball bat found at the scene. Additionally, the backs of her hands were bruised and covered in defensive wounds, indicating that she had fought fiercely until the end. Meanwhile, Luis had endured 51 knife wounds, some so deep that they exposed his bone and internal organs. Red marks on his neck suggested he may have been strangled. Unlike his sister, Luis had no defensive wounds, implying that he was caught off guard and unable to fight back. He also had signs of blunt force trauma on his limbs and torso. All these injuries were consistent with the weapons recovered at the scene. Investigators quickly ruled out the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. The scene had been staged while the rooms appeared ransacked. Only Gwen's phone was missing. Nothing else of value had been taken, leading authorities to believe that the killer or killers were familiar with the victims. It was also striking that the crime took place in broad daylight, which made the entire situation even more unsettling. Before the autopsy results were made public, rumors began circulating online, accusing Janice of being involved in the crime. These rumors gained traction due to her survival, the weapons being from the family home, and the locked front door. The accusations grew increasingly intense, with some even threatening Janice. Under the mounting pressure, the police decided to question her. Janice described the events of that day. She had been studying with Gwen in her bedroom while Lewis was downstairs in the living room. Suddenly, they heard Lewis screaming, and 3 men broke into the house. The 2 girls rushed downstairs and saw the 3 men attacking Lewis with the weapons found at the scene. The attackers then turned on Gwen, and in fear, Janice fled upstairs, locked herself in the bedroom, and hid under the bed. She was too scared to call the cops, so instead, she texted the family group chat, asking for help. Later, she messaged her adopted mom saying, "Mom, help." When no one saw those messages, Janice went a step further and posted on social media, saying, "Help! Somebody has broken into the house. I don't want to die. I'm hiding in my room. Help!" After a few minutes, she deleted the post, worried the attackers might see it and come after her. She tried calling her mom, but there was no answer. By the time someone saw the post and reached out to her mom, Janice was too scared to pick up. She went as far as changing her social media username and turning her phone to silent, clearly trying to hide. When the house finally fell silent, Janice emerged from her hiding place, too afraid to go downstairs. She claimed she took a shower and changed clothes to calm herself, finishing just as Cruz arrived home. But there was something odd about this part of the story. Janice had told the police she locked herself in her bedroom the second the attack started. So why did her room look like it had been ransacked? That raised some serious questions. More importantly, Janice's version of events was directly at odds with the forensic evidence. The autopsy results and the way the injuries were distributed made it clear that Gwen was the first victim, not Lewis. This major discrepancy between Janice's account and the evidence made investigators even more suspicious. Something wasn't adding up, and they started to take a closer look at Janice's statements. At first, she told the police her phone was off during the attack, but Cruz remembered calling her phone and hearing it ring with no answer. When Janice was confronted with this, she changed her story again, now claiming that she had been in the shower and hadn't heard her phone ringing. This was starting to sound fishy. In a case like this, who on earth could actually take a shower while their siblings were being attacked? It's just hard to wrap your head around, right? But that wasn't the only thing that raised eyebrows. Cruz also revealed some things about the murder weapons that added fuel to the fire. The baseball bat used in the attack originally belonged to Lewis. He had kept it in his room on the top bunk as a kind of protection. But after being adopted by Cruz, Janice had taken over the top bunk. The hammer used in the attack was another tool that Cruz kept around for home repairs. He was very careful about where he kept it, usually hiding it behind the washing machine. Cruz mentioned that only 3 people knew exactly where that hammer was: himself, Gwen, and Janice. This meant that the killer or killers had to have known the family's routines and possessions really well, almost like they had been living in the house with them. Things got even more suspicious when a delivery driver came forward. The driver had arrived at the house just 18 minutes before Cruz was contacted by a neighbor, who noticed no one had answered the door. The driver kept calling out, hoping someone would respond. Eventually, he noticed a woman peering at him through a door before she suddenly walked away. The woman's identity was never confirmed, but it raised serious doubts about where Janice was and what she was doing during the crucial moments of the attack. Another key clue came from the front door. It had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. This was a big deal because it meant that whoever had done this was probably someone who was familiar with the house, someone who had access to a key and could lock the door after the crime. At this point, it's pretty clear that Janice had something to do with the murders. However, since Janice was only 17 years old, still a minor under Philippine law, the police couldn't arrest her without solid proof. This legal issue made them tread carefully, as they couldn't move forward with an arrest until they had more definitive evidence. Instead of arresting her right away, the authorities placed Janice under the care of the Social Welfare Department, while the investigation turned to finding out who actually committed the murders. If Janice's claim about other people being involved was true, the police had a lot of work ahead of them. 5 days after the murders, a significant breakthrough occurred. The police discovered Janice's fingerprints on the murder weapons. This was a huge deal, but it wasn't the smoking gun. After all, Janice had lived in the house where the weapons were stored, so her prints could have been there simply from handling them. Still, it was a lead they couldn't ignore. To ensure she wasn't treated unfairly, Janice was given a lawyer by the Social Welfare Department. But things took another unexpected turn when Lavella, Janice's adoptive mother, found a contact tracing form while searching Janice's room for clues. The surprise? It wasn't Janice's form. It belonged to a 17-year-old boy named Esmeraldo Aldo Canedo Jr. Aldo was a sacristan at a local church, and Janice had known him from the orphanage. This discovery sent the police scrambling to figure out if Aldo had anything to do with the murders. And soon enough, witnesses came forward, confirming Aldo had been near the crime scene on the day of the killings. One woman said she saw Aldo drop Janice off near the house right before the murders, and another neighbor said she saw him asking for directions to the house that morning. When shown a picture of Aldo, the woman immediately recognized him. Then, on December 16th, 6 days after the murder, Janice, with her lawyer present, gave a full confession. She admitted to being involved in the murders along with Aldo and her so-called 21-year-old boyfriend, who was unnamed. Janice explained that her motive was deep resentment and jealousy. She felt that Gwen and Louis were getting all the love and attention from their parents, and in her mind, they were standing in the way of her getting the affection she had longed for. She even confessed that killing them would leave her as the only child in the family, guaranteeing she'd get all the love and attention she'd recently started experiencing after being adopted. Janice revealed that her ultimate goal was to take Gwen's place in the family, driven by years of emotional neglect in the orphanage where she had grown up. By December 18th, Janice's confession was officially recorded, though it was inconsistent, much like many of her previous statements. The police tracked down Aldo, who voluntarily surrendered, admitting his role too. Forensic analysis later confirmed that blood found on discarded clothing in a ditch belonged to Aldo. Like Janice, Aldo was a minor, so he was placed under the care of the Social Welfare Department. Later that same day, in an unrelated drug raid, police arrested a 17-year-old for possession of illegal substances. When they searched his phone, they found something that tied him to the case: Gwen's stolen cell phone. The serial number confirmed it had been taken after the murders. The police pieced it together. Janice had enlisted Aldo to sell the phone because she couldn't get rid of it herself due to growing suspicion. Unfortunately, the phone had been water damaged, making it impossible to retrieve any useful data. The boy who had the phone wasn't involved in the murders. He had simply bought it from Aldo. Because Janice and Aldo were minors, the police couldn't release any juicy details about their confessions to the public, despite the parents pressing for information. As the investigation progressed, Janice stopped cooperating, making it even harder to figure out exactly what had happened. Later on, it was revealed that Janice's 21-year-old boyfriend was just her imaginary boyfriend, and that really makes you question everything, especially since she had further stated that there were 3 people involved in the attack. Some people believe Janice's confessions weren't even the full story. Whispers circulated that the murders were even worse than she had let on, like the possibility that Louis was tied up and forced to watch as his sister was murdered before he was killed as well. After the shocking confessions, Lavella, the sibling's mother, was interviewed and reflected on the warning signs she missed. According to Lavella, they had adopted Janice 5 months before the murders. At first, everything seemed fine. The family welcomed her, and she appeared grateful. But soon, small red flags started to show. In August 2021, when Lavella's parents were hospitalized with COVID-19, Cruz noticed that 10,000 pesos, about $170, set aside for emergencies was missing. Janice claimed thieves had taken it, but the next day, a large sum was found hidden in her school bag. After some questioning, Janice admitted she had taken the money. Despite the breach of trust, the family, particularly Gwen, chose to forgive her. They were sympathetic to her troubled past, chalking up the theft to the survival instincts she had developed after years of hardship. Janice apologized, and the family, hoping this was a one-time mistake, accepted it, believing the worst was behind them. But as months passed, Janice's behavior started to shift in unsettling ways. Once known for her strong work ethic, which had been one of the reasons the family adopted her, she became lazy and irresponsible. Household chores were neglected, and when reminded, she apologized but never followed through. While troubling, it didn't raise any immediate alarms until the morning of the murders. That day, Janice did something she had never done before. She called Cruz and Lavella Mom and Dad for the first time. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a red flag, an indication of a deeper, darker shift in her emotional state. It was as if something had clicked in her mind, and what was about to happen was set in motion. As the investigation unfolded, more shocking truths came to light. Janice had lied about her origins from the start. Her story of being an orphan was a fabrication. Her parents were alive and had spent years desperately searching for her. When the case went viral, Filipino amateur sleuths dug into her past and uncovered a nearly decade-old missing persons notice. Like I mentioned earlier, Janice was discovered by a stranger in a cargo boat back in 2013, but no one could recognize her at the time. Her parents, especially her mom, weren't really active on Facebook back then, so they missed the post. Fast forward to the murders, and that same post started making rounds online again. It didn't take long for Janice's biological parents to recognize her. Born in 2005, Janice was the youngest of 3 kids, but her childhood was filled with chaos. Her dad's gambling addiction tore the family apart, and her mom, after remarrying, tried to make the best of things by splitting up what little they had left for her kids. Eventually, Janice and her siblings were placed in different orphanages. By 2020, Janice had actually reunited with her biological family, but that didn't last long. Her relatives later claimed she cut them off, saying they were too poor to be of any use to her. That betrayal shocked everyone, but things took a darker turn when Janice's biological mother, devastated by what her daughter had done, attended the funeral of Gwen and Louie. In her grief, she kept apologizing, full of guilt over her daughter's actions. In one heartbreaking moment, Janice's biological mom even kneeled down, but the Magwad parents weren't out for revenge. They made it clear that they weren't angry, just seeking justice. They insisted that Janice's biological mom encourage her daughter to confess. Janice's mother tried to visit her at the social welfare office, but Janice refused to see her, citing strict rules. Then, the investigation took a jaw-dropping turn. Evidence surfaced that suggested the murders were premeditated. Screenshots of a conversation between Janice and an unknown person went viral. In the messages, Janice confessed that she wanted to kill her siblings, thinking their deaths would give her the freedom she craved. She even wondered if anyone would still accept her if she committed murder, expressing a chilling belief that no matter what she did, God would forgive her if she just asked. Some sources later claimed that Janice often talked about the 2009 horror movie, Orphan, a film about a young girl adopted by a family who ultimately betrays and kills them. She even posted on Facebook that she loved the movie and watched it repeatedly. When Janice's trial began, her behavior was just as disturbing as the crime itself. She was seen smiling and laughing at her parents, showing no remorse or regret. Cruz and Lovella, devastated by the loss of their children, said in interviews that they might have forgiven Janice if she had shown even a hint of genuine remorse. But her coldness only made their pain worse. The case became a national sensation in the Philippines. From March 2022, when Janice and Esmeralda were officially charged with murder, to their conviction on May 17, 2022, the case was closely followed by the public. Janice was sentenced to 31 years in prison, while Esmeralda received a 29-year sentence. However, both sentences came with one condition. They would serve them under the Department of Social Welfare and Development Supervision until their 21st birthdays, after which they'd be transferred to adult prisons. Gwen and Luis's parents had mixed feelings about the trial's outcome. While they recognized that the courts handed down the toughest punishment possible under the law, they felt the laws were too soft. The biggest issue, though, was Janice's complete lack of remorse. Cruz and Lovella were outspoken against Republic Act 9344, which limits the legal accountability of minors. According to the law, the minimum age for criminal liability is 15, and individuals between the ages of 15 and 18 can be held accountable, but they're sent to youth centers or rehab programs instead of adult prisons. This law prevents minors like Janice from being tried as adults, even for heinous crimes like hers. Many argued that kids shouldn't be capable of planning or committing such brutal acts. In the US and other countries, minors committing these kinds of crimes would have been tried as adults. Cruz and Lovella felt strongly that Janice's age shouldn't excuse her from taking full responsibility, especially for such a violent and premeditated crime. This view was shared by many who felt the law was too lenient in cases like this. The couple publicly called for changes to the law, wanting those who commit violent acts at a young age to be held fully accountable. For them, the law's focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment made them feel that the justice system had failed their family. Some of the most heartbreaking facts to come out of the investigation revealed that Gwen almost escaped. She had the chance to run, but when she heard Janice calling for help, she went back, hoping to save her adopted sister. What makes it even more disturbing is that Gwen's kindness, her willingness to return to help, was met with betrayal. As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.